My grandfather left a will so strange the lawyer had to read it twice, and by the end of the second reading, $40 billion had turned my entire family into the best actors I have ever seen. The rule was simple, which is what made it cruel. The whole sterling fortune, the shipping empire, the towers, the private bank, the name that opened every door in this city, would not go to the oldest, or the smartest, or the one who'd worked hardest to earn it. It would go to whoever one specific person chose. For 30 days, every living sterling was required to move back into the old estate and live under one roof. And at the end of those 30 days, a single family member would name the heir, and that name would inherit everything, and the choice could not be appealed, questioned, or overturned. The person who got to choose was me. I should explain why the room went so quiet when the lawyer said my name, because the silence is the whole story. I am sterling only on paper. My name is Arthur, and I was adopted into this family at 9 years old. Not out of love, I understood that early, but because my grandfather, old Caspian Sterling, took one look at an orphan the family had been pressured into fostering and decided, for reasons no one ever explained to me, that I was staying. The rest of them never forgave the decision. To the Ashfords, I was the stray their patriarch had dragged in from the cold, a mistake with a place setting, tolerated because Caspian said so, and despised the exact amount they could get away with while Caspian was watching. For 21 years, I had been the quietest person at every table, because I'd learned by 9 that the quietest person is the one who gets to keep his food. And now the quietest person held $40 billion in the palm of his silence. You should have seen their faces when the lawyer finished. My Uncle Lawrence, who once had me eat in the kitchen while he entertained guests in the dining room, I'd embarrass. My cousin Spencer, the golden heir apparent, who'd spent our childhood inventing new words for what I was. My Aunt Seraphina, who signed my school forms with the visible reluctance of a woman handling something unclean. My older adoptive brother Tobias, who had never once, in 21 years, called me his brother out loud. All of them, in a single sentence, transformed from my judges into my supplicants, because the boy they'd spent 2 decades teaching that he was nothing was now the only thing standing between them and everything. The old me, the 9-year-old who learned to disappear, wanted to bolt from that room. But something my grandfather said in the will's final line held me in the chair. The lawyer read it last, and it was written to me specifically, in Caspian's own voice, and it said, "Arthur, you are the only one of them I ever trusted, because you are the only one who never wanted anything from me. I know what they did to you. I watched all of it. I am sorry I let it happen while I was alive. I told myself a hard childhood makes a strong man, and that was a coward's excuse for not protecting a boy. So here is your grandfather's apology, 30 years late, and it is a terrible gift, and I'm giving it to you anyway. 30 days. Watch them. They will show you everything. And then choose whoever you believe should carry this family, not whoever was kindest to you. Those are not the same person, and learning the difference is the last thing I have left to teach you. Not whoever was kindest to you." I sat in that lawyer's office and I understood in one cold breath exactly what my grandfather had done. He hadn't handed me a weapon, he'd handed me a mirror, and 30 days, and a family about to spend every one of them performing a love they'd never felt. And he was betting, from beyond the grave, the manipulative old genius, that watching people fake kindness would teach me more about them and about myself than a lifetime of their honest cruelty ever had. He was right. Of course he was right. Over the next 30 days, I would watch my brother bring me coffee in bed and remember exactly what he'd been the day before. I would watch a family that never let me sit at the table set my place at its head. I would learn which of them could fake it, which of them cracked, which of them, and this is the one that broke me, which one of them had never needed to fake anything at all. But that morning in the lawyer's office, all I knew was that yesterday these people wouldn't look at me, and today they couldn't look away. Let me take you into the house. Let me show you day 1. Act 1. The house that never wanted me. The Sterling estate is the kind of house that appears in magazines about houses. 40 rooms, a lake, a staff that had watched me grow up and been forbidden, subtly, from being too kind to me. I hadn't set foot in it in 6 years, since the day I turned 24, took the small trust my grandfather had quietly set aside for me, despite the family's objections, and left to build a life where no one knew the name Sterling or the particular way this family said it about me. I'd done all right out there. That's something you should know before the estate swallows the story, because it changes how you see everything I did next. I didn't need the money. In the 6 years I'd been gone, I'd built a modest, boring, genuinely mine software company. Nothing that would impress in Sterling, a few million in the bank, a life. I drove myself to the estate in a car that cost less than my cousin Spencer's watch, and I felt the old shrinking start the moment the gates opened. The 9-year-old in me folding himself small, and I had to remind myself out loud in the car, you are 30 years old, you own your own life, and they need you now. It didn't fully work. Houses like that keep you the age you were when they first taught you to be afraid. They were waiting on the front steps, all of them, arranged like a photograph of a loving family, which was the first performance and, in its way, the most impressive, because I had never once in my life seen these people stand together on those steps for anyone, least of all me. Lawrence reached me first, Uncle Lawrence, silver and smooth, who ran the shipping division and had the warmest fake smile in the Western Hemisphere. "Arthur," he said, and he took my hand in both of his, and his eyes actually glistened. The man could summon tears, I'll give him that. "My boy, it's been too long. This family lost its way with you, and I intend to spend these 30 days making that right." Behind him, my Aunt Serafina dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief she'd clearly brought for the purpose. My cousin Spencer, who'd once locked me out of the house in January to see how long I'd cry, stepped forward and pulled me into a hug, a real, full hug, and murmured into my shoulder, "I'm sorry, man, for everything, for all of it." And I stood there being embraced by the boy who'd invented a nickname for me so cruel I still couldn't say it. And over his shoulder I saw the lake where he'd once pushed me in and told the adults I'd slipped, and I thought, he doesn't even remember. That's the thing I understood on the front steps. He didn't remember January, or the lake, or the nickname. To Spencer, none of it had ever happened, because to Spencer I had never been real enough for what he did to me to count as things that happened. He wasn't performing forgiveness for old sins. He didn't think there were any sins. That was somehow worse than if he'd been lying. Only 2 people on those steps weren't performing. The first was my brother Tobias, older, adopted like me, but blood adjacent enough that the family had accepted him where they never accepted me. The one who'd spent 21 years never quite bullying me, but never once stopping it either. The bystander, the silent beneficiary of every cruelty he didn't have to commit because Spencer committed it for him. Tobias didn't hug me. He stood at the back, hands in his pockets, and gave me a single nod and said quietly, "Arthur." Just my name, no performance. I couldn't tell yet if that was honesty or just a better class of acting. And the second was a woman I didn't recognize, standing slightly apart from the family, holding a clipboard, watching all of it with an expression of open, unimpressed assessment. The only person on those steps looking at the family instead of at me. She caught my eye and didn't smile, and something in her flat, knowing look was the first real thing I'd felt since the gates opened, because it said plainly, "I see exactly what this is, and so do you, and isn't it something?" I found out later her name was Alara, and that my grandfather had hired her, and that she was the second half of his terrible gift. But on day one, she was just the one face in the crowd that wasn't lying to me, and I held on to it like a railing. Come in," Lawrence said, sweeping an arm toward the doors of the house that had never wanted me. "Your room is ready. We put you in the East Suite, the best view of the lake." The East Suite, the best room in the house. 21 years I'd slept in a narrow room over the garage, and the day I became worth $40 billion, they gave me the best view of the lake. I stepped through the doors of the Sterling estate as its most powerful person, and every instinct I'd built as its least powerful screamed at me to apologize for existing. I didn't apologize. That was day one's single small victory. I walked in, and I let them give me the best room, and I said thank you, and I started, quietly, the way I do everything, to watch. 30 days. My grandfather's voice in my head. Watch them. They will show you everything. They showed me everything. It just took me most of the 30 days to understand that the thing they showed me most clearly was not who deserved the money. It was who I had become while no one was looking. And whether the quietest person in the house had survived being nothing, or had only learned to wear it. Act 2. The Coffee. On the second morning, my brother Tobias brought me coffee in bed, and I want to tell you about that cup of coffee, because it is the whole 30 days in miniature, and because it is the moment I decided how I was going to survive them. I woke up in the East Suite, the best room, the lake view, the bed the size of the narrow room I'd grown up in over the garage, and there was a knock, soft, and Tobias came in carrying a tray. Coffee, exactly how I take it, which meant someone had asked the staff how I take it, which meant this had been planned. He set it on the nightstand. He said, "Morning, thought you might want this before everyone descends." And he stood there, a little awkward, my older brother, 33 years old, who had never once in 21 years brought me anything but silence. And I looked at the cup, and I did the math that I would do, in one form or another, every single day for a month. Yesterday, Tobias would not have brought me coffee. Yesterday, the actual yesterday, 6 years ago, 21 years ago, every yesterday that made me, Tobias stood in doorways with his hands in his pockets and watched Spencer do the things Spencer did and said nothing. And his nothing was its own kind of doing, because a bully needs an audience, and a bystander is the audience that makes the cruelty worth performing. Tobias never pushed me in the lake. He just never pulled me out. For 2 decades, he had perfected the art of being not the villain, while never once being the friend. And it had cost him nothing. And it had cost me a brother. And now he was bringing me coffee, because I was worth $40 billion. I drank it. That was my decision, the one I made with that first cup. I would take everything they offered, and I would say thank you, and I would never once pretend the offering meant what it was dressed up to mean. I would drink the coffee and remember the lake. Not out of spite, I want to be precise about this, because it matters for everything that comes later. Not to punish them, but because my grandfather had given me 30 days to see these people clearly. And you cannot see people clearly if you let their performance rewrite your memory. The coffee was not an apology. It was a bribe wearing an apology's face. And the single most important discipline of those 30 days, the thing that kept me from becoming what they were, was refusing to let a warm cup of coffee delete a cold childhood. I could accept the cup and keep the truth. Those are not the same surrender. "Thank you," I said to Tobias, and I meant the thank you exactly as much as he meant the coffee. Which is to say, we were 2 men performing a brotherhood at each other across a nightstand, and both of us knew it, and only one of us knew the other one knew. But here's the thing about Tobias, the thing that would take me 28 more days to fully understand. He was the worst actor in the family, and it wasn't because he was bad at lying. It was because some part of him wasn't lying, and it embarrassed him. He lingered by the door. He almost said something 3 times. And finally he said gruffly, not looking at me, "For what it's worth, I know coffee doesn't fix anything. I'm not going to insult you by pretending it does." And then he left, fast, like a man who'd said too much. I sat with that, because it was the first crack of something real in a house full of polished performances, and I didn't know yet whether it was real or just a more sophisticated con. A man smart enough to know that the way to win over someone allergic to flattery is to flatter him by refusing to flatter him. I genuinely couldn't tell. That uncertainty, it turned out, was the whole game my grandfather had built. He hadn't given me a family of obvious liars, which would have been easy. He'd given me a family in which the performances ranged from transparent to indistinguishable from truth, and the work of 30 days was learning to tell the difference, and discovering along the way that I'd never actually learned to tell the difference at all, because no one had ever bothered to be real with me long enough for me to practice. Downstairs, the rest of them descended, and the performances began in earnest. The house had rules now, my grandfather's rules, enforced by the lawyer and by a schedule pinned in the kitchen like a summer camp roster. All meals taken together, in the dining room I'd been made to eat outside of as a child. Everyone present, everyone civil. 30 days, no leaving the estate except for genuine emergencies, all of it witnessed and documented by the woman with the clipboard, Ilara, who ate at the foot of the table saying nothing and missing nothing. My grandfather had designed a pressure cooker and put the powerless boy in charge of the heat, and then he died and left us all inside it to see what we'd become when we couldn't escape each other and everything was on the line. At breakfast, they seated me at the head of the table. I need you to understand what that did to me, because it was not a small thing. 21 years I had eaten in the kitchen, over the garage, at the far end, outside, anywhere but the head of that table, which belonged to Caspian, and which the family would sooner have burned than let the stray sit at. And now they pulled out the patriarch's chair and gestured me into it, all of them smiling. Lawrence saying, "Where you belong, my boy." And I sat down in my dead grandfather's seat at the head of a table that had spent 2 decades teaching me I had no place at it. And I felt the 9-year-old in me start to cry, and I did not let him, because Elara was watching from the foot of the table, and her flat, unimpressed eyes were the only thing in the room telling the truth. And I would not perform my own pain for people who had caused it, and would only file it as leverage. "This is nice," Serafina said, my cold aunt, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "All of us together. It's what your grandfather always wanted." Above her practiced smile, her eyes were doing arithmetic, and I could see the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said, "How much is this squeeze worth, and can I afford a warmer one?" "It is nice," I agreed, and squeezed back, and did my own arithmetic, and thought, day 2, 28 to go. And somewhere in this house full of people performing love at the boy they never loved, my grandfather hid the real lesson, and I am going to find it, and I am not going to let the coffee make me forget the lake. Uncle Lawrence cleared his throat, and smiled his warm, terrible smile, and began the first real campaign of the 30 days. He was, of all of them, the most dangerous, because he was the only one good enough at it that even I, watching for it, sometimes forgot to breathe. Act 3. Uncle Julian's Campaign. Uncle Lawrence ran the shipping division, and he ran it the way he ran everything, which is to say he had never in his life met a person he couldn't find the price of. He'd spent 40 years buying senators, competitors, judges, and wives, and he looked at me across the breakfast table and saw, correctly, a man who could not be bought with money, and then made the single most impressive misjudgment of the 30 days, which was to assume that a man who can't be bought with money can be bought with something else, and to spend 2 weeks patiently searching for my currency. His opening move was breakfast itself. Over eggs, he told a story, a warm, funny, self-deprecating story about Caspian, about the two of them clashing over the Rotterdam expansion, and then, casually, seamlessly, he wove me into it. "And your grandfather said to me, 'Lawrence, the only person in this family with any sense is the quiet one.' And I said, 'Which quiet one?' And he said, 'The boy Arthur. He watches everything and says nothing. That's a CEO's temperament. That's worth more than all your noise.' And I was offended at the time, Arthur, I'll admit it. But the old man was right. He was always right about you." He raised his coffee to me. He saw it before any of us. I'm ashamed it took me this long to see it too. It was a beautiful lie. I want to give Lawrence his due, because most of the family lied like amateurs, and Lawrence lied like a master. And the difference is that a master's lie is built almost entirely out of true bricks. Caspian probably had said something like that once. Lawrence probably had been offended. The whole thing had the texture of memory. Only the frame was false, the frame that said, "I've always secretly respected you," when the truth was that Lawrence had, at my college graduation, introduced me to a business partner as our Arthur, sort of a project of my father's. Sort of a project. I remembered the exact tilt of his mouth when he said it, and now the same mouth was telling me Caspian had called me a CEO's temperament. And the horrible thing was that part of me wanted it to be true. Part of the 9-year-old ached to believe that somewhere in the wreckage of that family, someone had seen something in me. And Lawrence had found that ache with the precision of a man who'd spent 40 years finding aches. That was his gift. He didn't offer you money. He offered you the thing you'd wanted your whole life, wrapped so perfectly, in fact, that refusing it felt like refusing yourself. Over the following days, Lawrence escalated with the patience of a professional. He took me on a walk around the lake and told me, in confidence, man to man, that he'd always disagreed with how the family treated me, that he'd argued for me behind closed doors, that Serafina and Spencer were the real architects of my exile, and he'd been outvoted. A separating move, turn the mark against the other players, become the one ally in a house of enemies. Then he began, gently, to educate me about the empire, positioning himself as the indispensable one. "You'll need someone who actually understands the shipping contracts, Arthur. Spencer couldn't read a bill of lading if his life depended on it. Nevertheless, in Harrods, they'll need me to run it. and I'd rather run it for someone I respect. Building himself into the future no matter who I chose, the survivor's play, the man who wins whether or not he's named, because he's made himself load-bearing. And then, on day 9, Lawrence made his real offer, the one under all the others, in his study with the door closed and 2 glasses of 40-year-old scotch poured. "Let's stop dancing," he said, warm, direct, a man finally being honest, which was itself the most sophisticated performance yet. "You're going to choose someone. I think we both know it shouldn't be Spencer. The boy's a peacock. He'd run this into the ground in a decade. It shouldn't be Serafina. She's cold. The staff would revolt. Tobias doesn't want it, never has. He's too busy being wounded. That leaves me, and it leaves you. So here's what I propose. You name me, and the day it's done, I sign over 15% of the holding company to you, personally. No strings, real money, generational money, yours. You don't want the throne, I can see that. You're not built to sit on it. But you'd be a fool to walk away with nothing. Name the man who can actually run it, and take your cut, and go live your quiet life a very rich man. Everybody wins." And I'll be honest with you, because I've been honest this whole time. It was a good offer. It was, on its face, the rational offer. Lawrence genuinely could run the empire better than the others. 15% of the Sterling Holding Company was more money than I'd make in 10 lifetimes of my little software company. And the framing was perfect. It flattered me as the wise man above the fray. It insulted my enemies. It asked me to do the sensible thing and be rewarded for it. If I'd been who they thought I was, a stray desperate for a scrap of the fortune that had defined my unworthiness, I'd have taken it in a heartbeat. But I wasn't who they thought I was. And I looked at Uncle Lawrence, warm and reasonable, and offering me a fortune to hand him an empire. And I did the arithmetic I did every day. And I remembered a thing he had no idea I remembered. When I was 12, I'd gotten pneumonia. Bad. Hospital bad. From a January night I'd rather not detail. And Lawrence had come to visit, once, and I'd been half-conscious and heard him in the hall talking to my grandfather, not knowing I could hear, and he'd said, "Honestly, Father, would it be the worst thing? The boy's a liability. You could quietly let this run its course and no one would blame you." He'd suggested, in a hospital hallway, that my grandfather let a 12-year-old die because I was inconvenient. And Caspian had thrown him out of the hospital and sat by my bed for 3 nights, which is, I understand now, the exact moment Caspian decided I was the only one he trusted. I looked at Lawrence across his 40-year-old scotch, and I saw the man in the hallway, and I understood that he had no idea I'd heard, that to him, that hallway had never happened, that he was sitting across from a liability he'd once suggested letting die and offering it 15%. And I felt the temperature drop the way it does, and I smiled, and I said, "That's a generous offer, Uncle Lawrence. I'll think about it." And I sipped the scotch, and I thought, I already know what you are. I've known since I was 12. I'm just here to find out if anyone in this house is anything else. Lawrence smiled, satisfied, certain he'd landed me. That was his one flaw, the flaw of all master manipulators. He could not conceive of a person who would hear his best offer and simply file it as evidence. He thought the game was buying. I was playing a different game entirely, and so was my grandfather. And so, though I didn't know it yet, was the woman at the foot of the table. The next player to make her move was Spencer. And Spencer, unlike his father, could not act his way out of a paper bag, which made him, in his own way, the most honest liar in the house. Act 4. Marcus, the honest liar. Spencer was the golden heir, the one everyone had assumed would inherit before the will detonated that assumption, and he was, God help him, the worst actor I have ever watched, which paradoxically made him the most bearable person in the house, because with Spencer, at least, you always knew exactly where the cruelty was. It was right there on his face, badly hidden behind a smile that kept slipping like a mask 2 sizes too big. Spencer had spent our entire childhood being the son the family orbited, and being the son had taught him a specific disability. He had never once had to imagine another person's inner life, because no one's inner life had ever mattered to his own. He couldn't act because acting requires modeling what someone else feels, and Spencer had never modeled what anyone felt, least of all me. So when he tried to perform contrition, it came out as a kind of transactional pantomime, a boy who'd learned the shapes of apology from movies without ever understanding the engine underneath. His campaign was clumsy, and it was constant. He'd sit next to me at meals and reminisce about a childhood we had not shared. Remember when we used to build forts by the lake? Inventing a warm boyhood out of whole cloth, apparently having genuinely forgotten that the lake was where he'd pushed me in, that the forts were things he'd built with his real friends, while I watched from the garage window. And the terrifying thing, the thing I kept coming back to, was that I don't think he was lying exactly. I think Spencer had rewritten his own childhood so completely, so effortlessly, that he actually remembered building forts with me, because in the version of the past where Spencer is a good person, we were friends. And Spencer needed to be a good person more than he needed the past to be true. He wasn't performing a false memory, he was living in one. That's what being the sun does to you. You get to keep whichever version of events lets you stay warm. But Spencer couldn't sustain it, and that was the gift he gave me, the cracks. On day 11, a member of the staff, an older woman named Elena, who'd worked in that house for 30 years, brought the wrong wine to dinner, and Spencer, forgetting himself for exactly 3 seconds, snapped at her. Are you actually incapable of reading a label, or do you just enjoy embarrassing this family? In the exact tone, the precise cold contempt that I had heard aimed at me across 2 decades. And then he remembered where he was, and who was watching, and he caught himself, and he turned to me with the mask hastily reassembled and said, "Sorry, Arthur, good help is impossible these days, you know how it is." And he laughed, inviting me to laugh with him, to bond over our shared superiority to the woman he'd just humiliated. I did not laugh. I looked at Elena, who had gone rigid with the specific stillness of a person absorbing a cruelty they cannot afford to react to, a stillness I knew from the inside, a stillness I had worn at that very table for 21 years, and I said quietly, "The wine's perfect, Elena. Thank you." Spencer was just leaving the table to cool off, and the room went silent, and Spencer's mask fell all the way off for 1 full second, and I saw underneath it the boy who'd pushed me in the lake, the one who'd never for one instant believed that people like Elena or people like me were the same kind of real as him. He stared at me with pure, undisguised hatred, the first honest thing he'd shown me since I arrived, and I stared back, and I understood that Spencer would never, could never, fake his way through 30 days, because his contempt for the powerless was not a behavior he could suppress. It was the load-bearing structure of his entire self. Take away his right to look down on Elena, on me, on the staff, on anyone beneath him, and there was no Spencer left standing. He literally did not know how to be a person who didn't have someone to be better than. That dinner was the first time I understood the real test my grandfather had built, though I wouldn't be able to put it into words for another 2 weeks. It wasn't a test of how they treated me. Of course they'd treat me well. I held $40 billion. A chimpanzee would be nice to the man holding $40 billion. The test was how they treated Elena, how they treated the people who could do nothing for them, the powerless, the invisible, the ones who couldn't affect the outcome, because that, and only that, is where a person's true character lives. Not in how they treat the powerful, which is just strategy, but in how they treat the powerless, which is just truth. Caspian had put me at the head of the table not so I could watch them flatter me, but so I could watch them, off guard, in the long, boring hours between performances, reveal how they treated everyone who wasn't holding the money. And Spencer had just failed the test in the most complete way possible, and didn't even know a test existed, because it had genuinely never occurred to him that how you treat a woman bringing wine could matter to anything at all. Later that night, Spencer found me alone and tried to repair it, and his repair was the most Spencer thing imaginable. "Look," he said, "about the Elena thing, I overreacted, but between us you get it, right? You and me, we're the same. We both know what it's like to be Ashfords, to have standards. These people, the staff, they're not, you understand what I mean." He was trying to recruit me into his contempt as a peace offering. He was offering me, as a gift, membership in the club that had spent 20 years excluding me. And he genuinely thought it would work, because in Spencer's mind, the only possible reason I defended Elena was to score a point, not because I actually saw her as a person, because Spencer could not conceive of actually seeing a servant as a person, and so he assumed I was faking it the same way he faked everything. "Spencer," I said, "for 21 years I was Elena. I was the person you snapped at for existing wrong. The only difference between me and her is that my grandfather left me a will." I let that sit. So no, we're not the same. You just never noticed, because you've never once in your life looked closely at anyone you didn't need something from. Good night. I left him there, and his face was doing something complicated. Not remorse. Spencer didn't have the equipment for remorse. But the beginning of fear. The dawning animal awareness that the person holding $40 billion had just told him he'd failed a test he didn't understand and couldn't retake. It was the first genuinely satisfying moment of the 30 days. And I noted with some alarm exactly how much I enjoyed it. Because enjoying it was the first sign of the thing my grandfather had warned me about. The thing that would nearly cost me my soul before day 30. The slow, seductive pleasure of holding power over people who'd been powerful over you. Ilara saw it on my face. Of course she did. She saw everything. And that night, as I passed her in the hall, she said the first full sentence she'd ever said to me, and it went off in my chest like a small bomb. "Careful," she said, not unkindly. "You're starting to like it. That's how he'd have gotten you if he'd wanted to. Your grandfather. That's the trap in the gift." And she walked on and left me standing in the hallway of the house that never wanted me, holding a power I was beginning, dangerously, to enjoy. Act 4B, the inventories of flattery. I want to slow down and let you sit inside the middle of the 30 days, the long stretch between the first performances and the final desperation, because the middle is where the hypocrisy got so thick you could have spread it on toast. And because there is a specific pleasure in watching people who spent 20 years telling you that you were nothing suddenly compete to tell you that you were everything. And I would be lying if I pretended I didn't feel that pleasure, day after day, like a warm bath I knew I shouldn't stay in too long. Let me give you the inventory, the daily ledger of a family performing love at the boy they'd exiled, with the deadline ticking over all of it like a clock in a room where no one will admit they can hear it. Day 6. Lawrence had the staff repaint the small sitting room off the library, my mother's old favorite color, he claimed, though he could not possibly have known my mother's favorite color since my mother died when I was 9, and Lawrence never once asked me a single thing about her in 21 years. But he'd found out, somewhere, that a color existed that I might attach to her, and he'd had a room repainted in it, so that I might wander in and be moved. I wandered in. I was moved. For exactly the half-second before I remembered that a man who repaints a room to manipulate your grief is a man who has studied your grief the way a burglar studies a lock. 15 days left, said the clock no one mentioned. Day 7. Spencer gave me a watch, his own watch, the one that cost more than the car I'd driven to the estate, pressed into my hands at breakfast with a speech about how he'd always admired that I didn't care about material things, and wanted me to have something nice for once. It was a magnificent object, and it was an insult wearing a bow, because the entire message underneath it was, "You poor thing, let me, who has everything, bestow upon you, who has nothing, a taste of the world you'll never belong to." I thanked him, and I wore it once, at dinner, and I watched him glow at the sight of his watch on the stray's wrist, and I took it off that night and never wore it again, and he never noticed I'd stopped, because the gift had never been for me. It was a photograph he wanted to take of himself being generous. 14 days left. Day 8. Serafina began leaving me small, handwritten notes. "Thinking of you this morning. Your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become. So glad we have this time." Each one perfect, each one calibrated, each one signed with a warmth she had never once shown me across 2 decades of signing my school forms like they were quarantine papers. I kept them all, not out of sentiment, as evidence, the same way she was building her own case, except mine was a case about her. 13 days. Day 9 through 11 blurred into a single texture of it. The staff briefed to report my preferences so that my coffee appeared exactly right. My meals were exactly what I liked. The temperature of every room adjusted to a comfort I'd never once been afforded as a child in that house, where I'd shivered over the garage while these same rooms were kept warm for these same people. They had always had the power to make me comfortable. They had simply never, in 21 years, considered me worth the thermostat. Now the thermostat followed me from room to room like a courtier, and the pleasure I felt, I have to be honest about the pleasure, was not the pleasure of comfort. It was the darker thing, the thing Ilara had warned me about, the pleasure of watching people who denied me warmth now scramble to provide it, the pleasure of the inversion itself. That pleasure is a poison with an extraordinary flavor, and I sipped it every day of that middle stretch, and every day it tasted a little better and left me a little worse. Day 12. This is the one I'm least proud of, so I'll tell it plainly. Spencer, trying too hard, made a joke at dinner at Tobias's expense, some old cruelty repackaged as banter, the kind of thing Spencer did to everyone eventually, and I watched Tobias absorb it in silence, and instead of stepping in, I let it happen. Worse, I enjoyed it, a little, because for once the cruelty in that room was aimed at someone other than me, and some small, starved part of me was glad to not be the target for once, glad to watch someone else hold the coat. It lasted a moment. Then I saw myself doing it, saw myself becoming a person who found relief in someone else being the one diminished, and I felt sick. Because that is the exact mechanism. That is how a house like that reproduces itself. That is how a bullied child grows into a bully, not through malice, but through the sheer relief of finally not being the one at the bottom, and the willingness to let someone else take your old place there. I said something, late, too late, to redirect it. But I'd felt the thing. I'd felt how easy it would be to spend the rest of the 30 days quietly grateful that the family's cruelty now had other targets, and to call my silence peace. 12 days left, and I understood that the deadline wasn't only counting down to a choice about them. It was counting down to a verdict on me, because that was the thing the ticking clock actually measured in the middle of the 30 days, not how long until I chose an heir, but how long I could sit inside the warm poison of inverted power before it changed what I was. Every day the flattery got richer, and the pleasure got deeper, and the person I'd been when I drove through those gates got a little harder to find. My grandfather had given me 30 days, not because it takes 30 days to see who a family is, I'd seen that by day 3, but because it takes about 30 days of holding power over the people who hurt you to find out whether you can hold it without becoming them. And the answer is not guaranteed, and the clock was counting down to my answer as much as to theirs. Ilara kept me honest through the middle. That was her whole function, and I understand now it was the function Caspian hired her for. Not to witness the family, the cameras could do that, but to witness me, to stand in the hallways of my worst month and keep catching me at the exact moments the poison tasted best. "You like that?" she'd say, quiet, after some dinner where I'd let myself savor Spencer's fear or Lawrence's groveling a beat too long. "I know you did. I'm not judging you for liking it, anyone would. I'm just not going to let you pretend you didn't, because the day you can enjoy it without noticing is the day you've lost." And she was right, every time. And I hated it every time. And it saved me every time. So that's the inventory of the middle. Repainted rooms and gifted watches and calibrated notes and a thermostat that finally deigned to follow the stray from room to room. And underneath all of it, a boy discovering that the sweetest and most dangerous thing in the world is watching the people who taught you you were nothing line up to tell you you're everything. And that the whole test, the real one, was whether you could taste that and set the glass down. Most days I set it down. Some days Ilara had to take it out of my hand. And the clock ticked, 13, 12, 11, counting down to 2 verdicts at once, and I could feel both of them coming. Act 5. Aunt Vivienne and the Weapon of Guilt. If Lawrence's currency was flattery and Spencer's was contempt he couldn't hide, my Aunt Serafina dealt in the most sophisticated currency of all, the one I was least defended against, because it was the only one that came dressed as the truth I'd wanted my whole life. Serafina's weapon was guilt, her own, offered up like a gift, and mine, activated like a switch she'd found in me 20 years ago and never forgotten the location of. Serafina was Caspian's daughter, Spencer's mother, and the coldest person I'd known as a child. The one who'd signed my school forms like she was handling something contaminated, who'd never once hugged me, who'd made me feel, more than anyone, like a stain the family was too polite to name. So when she came to me on day 13, sat down across from me in the library, and began to cry, real tears, or tears indistinguishable from real, and said, "Arthur, I have spent 20 years hating myself for how I treated you," I felt the ground tilt, because this was the one thing none of the others had thought to offer. Not flattery, not a bribe, an apology that named the actual crime. "I was a coward," she said, and her voice cracked in exactly the place a broken voice cracks. I told myself you weren't really ours. I told myself Father made a mistake bringing you in, and I punished you for his decision because I couldn't punish him. You were a child. You were a little boy who'd lost everything, and instead of loving you, I made you feel like an intruder in the only home you had left. I have to live with that. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking you to let me say it once, out loud, before your grandfather's 30 days are over, because he's dead now, and I never told him I was sorry either, and I can't carry 2 graves of things I never said. It was devastating. It was, I have to admit, the single most effective thing anyone did to me in those 30 days, and here is why. It was probably even partly true. That's what made Serafina dangerous in a way Lawrence and Spencer weren't. Lawrence's regret was pure invention. Spencer had no regret at all. But Serafina, I genuinely believe Serafina did carry some real guilt, a real cold splinter of shame about the child she'd helped exile, and she had done the thing that only the truly skilled manipulators can do. She'd taken a real feeling and aimed it. She wasn't fabricating an emotion. She was weaponizing an authentic one. And a weaponized truth is far harder to defend against than a lie, because every instinct you have for detecting falseness comes back clean. My grandmother, no, that's the other story. But everything in me that could smell a lie smelled nothing, because there was no lie to smell. There was only a real regret, deployed at the exact moment for the exact purpose of moving $40 billion. I almost fell for it. I want to be honest about how close I came, because the near miss is the whole point. I sat in that library and I felt the 21-year-old ache in me rise up and reach for her apology like a drowning man reaching for a hand. Because it was the apology, the real one, the one that named what had actually been done to me. And no one had ever given me that. And some starving part of me did not care that it was being handed over as a bribe. That part of me wanted to take it and weep and give her the money just to be allowed, finally, to believe that one of them had seen the wrong and felt it. That part of me nearly did. What saved me was a detail, a small one. As Serafina cried and named her cowardice, I noticed she never once said Spencer's name. She confessed her own cruelty in exhaustive, moving detail, but she said nothing about her son, who had pushed me in the lake, who had invented the nickname, who had snapped at Elena 2 nights before. A mother genuinely reckoning with how her family had failed a child would have had to reckon with what her golden boy had done. The crimes were inseparable. You could not honestly grieve my childhood without grieving what Spencer made of it. But Serafina's confession had been carefully, surgically shaped to include only her own sins and exclude her son's, because the entire purpose of the confession was to move the money toward her branch of the family, and Spencer was still, in her mind, the ultimate destination of that money. She wasn't confessing to heal me. She was confessing to position herself and, through herself, her son. The tears were real. The regret might even have been real. But the shape of it, the precise exclusion of Spencer, revealed that even her most authentic feeling had been bent entirely in service of the game. She could grieve me sincerely and still be using the grief as a lever. Both were true. That's the most human and most horrifying thing I learned in that house, that people can genuinely feel the thing they're faking, and fake it anyway, and the feeling doesn't make it less of a fake. Thank you for saying that, Serafina, I said. And I meant the thank you because some of it deserved thanks. I think you probably do regret it, at least partly. I believe that. Her face lifted, hopeful. But you didn't mention Spencer. You listed everything you did to me, and you left out the person who did the most, and he's your son, and you'd have to be blind not to have seen it. And you're not blind. So I think you're telling me the truth about your guilt, and using the truth about your guilt at the same time. And I don't know how to hold both of those, except to notice that you managed to apologize for my whole childhood without once protecting me from the person who's still in this house. I stood up. That's not an accusation. I actually don't know if you can even tell the difference anymore between what you feel and what you're doing with it. But I can. My grandfather made sure I'd have 30 days to learn how. She stopped crying rather abruptly, which told me more than the crying had. And in her eyes, for just a moment, I saw the cold calculation reassert itself over the warm performance, the arithmetic clicking back on, and I understood that Serafina, unlike Spencer, knew exactly what she was, knew she was using a real feeling as a tool, and had made her peace with it long ago. That was, in a way, the most damning thing of all. Spencer was cruel because he couldn't see other people. Serafina saw them perfectly, felt for them genuinely, and used them anyway. Of the two, I understood at last. The one who sees you and betrays you is worse than the one who never saw you at all. 2 weeks in, and I'd mapped 3 of them. Lawrence, the master, buying with flattery and 15%. Spencer, the son, unable to fake basic density to anyone he didn't need. Serafina, the surgeon, wielding real guilt as a scalpel. 3 performances, 3 failures, 3 people who treated me like a king and the powerless like furniture. Which left Tobias, my bystander brother, who kept bringing me coffee and refusing to pretend it meant anything. And it left Ilara, the watcher, who kept saying true things in hallways. And it left the letters, because on day 14, the lawyer delivered the first of the sealed envelopes my grandfather had left me, 1 for every week. And the first envelope told me a truth about the sterling fortune that changed the entire game, and made me wonder whether the prize I was holding over their heads was a gift at all, or a curse I'd be cruel to hand anyone. Act 6, the first letter. On day 14, the lawyer arrived at the estate with a sealed envelope, the first of 4, 1 for each week of the 30 days, each to be opened on schedule and read by me alone. My grandfather had planned even this, a slow drip of truth timed to arrive as I needed it, a dead man pacing his own confession. I took the envelope up to the East Suite, and I locked the door, and I opened it, and I read the first honest thing anyone in that family had told me in 21 years, which is a strange thing to say about a letter from a corpse. Arthur, it began, in Caspian's hard, slanted hand. By now you've had a week to watch them, and you've seen what they are, and you're probably starting to enjoy the seeing, and that's the first thing I need to warn you about, but not the most important. The most important thing is this. I need to tell you where the money came from, because you cannot make an honest choice about who should carry a thing until you know what the thing actually is. And the sterling fortune is not what this family believes it is. It is not a triumph. It is a debt. Then he told me the story the family never told, the one behind the towers and the shipping lines and the name that opened doors. Caspian Sterling had not built the empire out of genius and grit, or not only out of those. He'd built it, in the early years, out of other people. Out of a partner he'd cheated out of a founding stake and driven to ruin. Out of workers he'd broken. Out of a dozen smaller men he'd crushed on the way up because crushing them was faster than out-competing them. He named them in the letter. He made himself name every one of them, the way a man setting his affairs in order forces himself to itemize what he owes. There was a page and a half of names, of ruined lives, of the true and ugly foundation of $40 billion, and at the end of it Caspian wrote, I built a monument, and I built it on graves, and I told myself for 50 years that the monument justified the graves, and it was a lie I only stopped believing when I got old enough to see the graves more clearly than the monument. And then, at the bottom of the first letter, the sentence that stopped my heart, that I read 6 times, that reorganized the entire 30 days around a new center of gravity. The worst of them, the man I ruined most completely, the one whose destruction I have never been able to forgive myself for. His name was Frederick Vance. And Frederick Vance had a son. And when that son was orphaned, largely because of what I had done to his father, I found him, and I brought him into my home, and I gave him my name, and I told everyone it was charity. It was not charity, Arthur. It was the closest thing to atonement a coward like me could manage. You are not a stray I took in. You are the son of the best man I ever destroyed, and I have spent 21 years unable to tell you, because telling you would mean telling you that the family who despised you did so while living inside a fortune built on the ruin of your own father. You are not the intruder in this house. You are the only one in it with a real claim to be angry, and you are the only one who never once got angry, and that is why you are the one I trust. I sat in the East Suite for a long time, and I did not move. Everything rearranged. Every cruelty I'd absorbed for 21 years, every meal in the kitchen, every January, every sort of a project of my father's. All of it had happened to the orphaned son of the man Caspian Sterling had ruined to build the very house we were fighting over. The family that treated me as a stain had been living on my father's grave the entire time, and none of them knew. And I hadn't known, and my grandfather had carried it silently and then handed it to me from beyond death, along with $40 billion and 30 days and a choice, because he understood, the terrible, brilliant old man, that the only person who could make a just decision about a stained fortune was the person it had been stolen from. And now the prize looked completely different in my hands. It wasn't $40 billion anymore. It was $40 billion soaked in the ruin of a dozen families, including my own, a monument built on graves. And my grandfather was asking me not just to choose who got it, but to decide what a thing like that even meant, whether it was a gift you could give someone you loved, or a curse you'd only hand someone you wanted to see destroyed. Was inheriting the Sterling Empire winning, or was it agreeing to carry the debt, to stand on the graves, to become the next warden of a monument that ate people? I looked at Lawrence, at Spencer, at Serafina, so hungry for it, and for the first time I felt something other than the old fear or the new pleasure. I felt pity. They were fighting, tooth and claw, performing love at the orphan, to win the right to inherit a mountain of graves they didn't even know were there. They thought they were competing for a fortune. They were competing to be the one who'd have to answer for it. The letter had one more line, a postscript, and it was the line that set the real course of everything that followed. "Do not decide yet what to do with the truth about your father," Caspian wrote. "You will want to use it, to hurt them, to expose me, to burn it all down, and God knows you'd be entitled. But wait. Watch the rest of the 30 days first. Because there is one person in that house who, if you watch closely, will show you what a person does when they think no one is looking and there's nothing to gain. And that person will teach you what the money is actually for, and whether it can ever be anything but a curse. I won't tell you who. Finding out is the point. Just watch how they treat the ones who can do nothing for them. That is the whole test. It always was. Watch how they treat the ones who can do nothing for them." I folded the letter, and I understood finally in words the test my grandfather had built, the test I'd felt at dinner when Spencer snapped at Elena but hadn't been able to name. The 30 days were never about who was kindest to the man with the money. They were about who was kind to Elena, to the gardener, to the powerless, to the version of me that couldn't affect the outcome. Because how a person treats the powerful is strategy, and how a person treats the powerless is truth. And my grandfather had trapped an entire family in a house with a small army of powerless people, the staff, and a boy who used to be one of them, and told me to watch. I started watching differently after that. Not the performances aimed at me, those were noise. I started watching the edges, how Lawrence spoke to the driver, how Serafina treated the young woman who did her hair, how Spencer looked through Elena like she was weather, and how one person in that house, I won't tell you who yet because finding out was the point for me and I'll let it be the point for you, treated the powerless exactly the same whether I was in the room or not. But before I could finish watching, the game changed, because on day 16 the family stopped competing against each other for my favor and started quietly, viciously, competing against each other directly, sabotaging, exposing, knifing one another in the back in front of me, each believing that destroying a rival was as good as winning me. And watching them turn on each other taught me the last thing I needed to know about what $40 billion does to people who believe they deserve it. Act 7. Cora, who watched. I have to tell you about Alara now because by the middle of the 30 days, she'd become the only person in that house I could breathe around. And because she was the second half of my grandfather's gift, and because, I'll just say it, I would end those 30 days having lost $40 billion and found her. And if you'd offered me the trade in advance, I'd have hesitated only long enough to pretend I was thinking about it. Ilara had been hired by my grandfather through the lawyer for a single job: to witness. To live at the estate for the 30 days, document everything, and ensure the terms of the will were honored. An impartial observer, present at every meal, in every hallway, missing nothing. The family treated her the way they treated all the staff, which is to say they treated her like furniture that could hear, and they said things in front of her they'd never have said in front of me, and Alara wrote all of it down in a way they assumed was procedural and was, in fact, a complete forensic record of who they were when they thought the only person watching didn't count. That was Caspian's design. He knew the family would perform for me and forget to perform for the help. So he put a brilliant, watchful woman in the position of the help and let their own contempt for the powerless blind them to the fact that the most important witness in the house was the one they kept forgetting to lie to. But Elara was more than a witness, and I figured out the first layer of it around day 17. She was too sharp, too educated, too unbothered by these people to be a hired clipboard. She'd correct Lawrence's misremembered history under her breath. She'd name a shipping route Spencer got wrong. She knew the Sterling Empire the way you only know a thing you've studied obsessively or lived inside. And when I finally asked her directly, alone, in the kitchen at midnight where we'd both drifted, the two people in the house who couldn't sleep. "Who are you, really? Because you're not a clerk." She looked at me for a long moment, deciding, and then she told me a piece of the truth, and kept the biggest piece back, the way I was keeping the truth about my father back. Two people circling each other's secrets in a dark kitchen. "My grandmother worked in this house," she said. 40 years ago, before your time, before Lawrence ran anything. She was staff, like Elena. And your grandfather, old Caspian, did something to her family. Something he spent the rest of his life being sorry for, though sorry never gave anyone their life back." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "When his lawyer contacted me about this job, I almost said no. I didn't want to spend a month in the house that ruined my family. Then I read the will, and I understood what the old man was actually doing, using his own death to force these people to show themselves to someone who could finally judge them honestly. And I thought, I want to see that. I want to watch the Ashfords stand trial in their own dining room and not even know it's a trial. So I took the job, for my grandmother, to watch." She looked at me. "And then you walked in, and I realized the old man hadn't just built a trial. He'd made the judge someone the family had done the exact same thing to. Two of us, Arthur. Two people in this house whose families they destroyed to build all this. Except I only get to watch. You get to decide." There was more. I could feel there was more. A whole further truth she was holding, the way you can feel the weight of a closed door. But she'd given me enough, and it was enough to change everything, because it meant I was not alone in that house anymore. There was one other person who saw the fortune as I was learning to see it, as a monument on graves, including hers, including mine. One other person who wanted nothing from the money because the money was made of her family's ruin and she wouldn't have touched it if you'd begged her. In a house of people performing love to win a cursed prize, Elara and I were the only two who understood the prize was cursed, and the only two who couldn't be bought with it. And there is a particular intimacy in being the only two sane people in a burning building. And Elara did the thing for me that no one else in that house could have done, the thing that kept me from becoming a sterling in the worst month of my life. She watched me. Not the way the family watched me, for leverage, for the tell of which way I was leaning. She watched me the way my grandfather's letter watched me, for the state of my soul. And she kept catching me. When I enjoyed Spencer's fear too much, she caught it. When I started to relish the power, when I felt the old victim in me discover the new pleasure of making my tormentors sweat, she was there in a hallway with a quiet, unsparing, "Careful, you're starting to like it." She would not let me pretend that holding power over people who'd hurt me was justice. She kept insisting it was just power, the same power they'd held over me, and that the only difference between me and them would be what I did with it, and that the whole trap of my grandfather's gift was that it felt like justice while it turned you into the thing you were judging. He tested them by giving them a powerless person to be cruel to, she told me one night. You, Elena, the staff. But Arthur, he's testing you too. He gave you power over people who deserve to suffer, and he's watching, from wherever he is, to see whether you can hold that much power over people who wronged you and not become someone who enjoys wronging back. That's your test. Theirs is whether they're kind to the powerless. Yours is whether you can be powerful without becoming cruel. And you're failing a little right now, and I like you too much to watch you fail it. So I'm telling you, the money isn't the prize and it isn't the curse. The curse is what wanting to hurt them back will do to you if you let it. Don't let the old man's gift make you in sterling. You're the only one in this house who isn't. Stay that way. I looked at her across the midnight kitchen, this woman whose family my family had also destroyed, who wanted none of the money, who had every reason to want the Ashfords to burn, and instead was standing guard over the soul of the one sterling who could burn them. And I understood that I was, against every rule of sense and timing, beginning to fall in love with her, and that she knew it. and that she was, very carefully, not saying whether she felt it too, because there were still 2 weeks left in a game where everything was uncertain, and she was too honest to offer me something she couldn't yet mean, and too kind to reject something I couldn't yet help. "Why do you care what I become?" I asked her. "You could just watch." "That's the job." "Because," Elara said, "my grandmother spent 40 years poor and bitter about what this family took from her, and it ate her alive, the wanting them to suffer. It was its own kind of prison. I watched it eat her, and I'll be damned if I stand in this house and watch it start eating you too, when you've got a real chance to walk out the one person the Ashfords couldn't turn into a sterling." She stood, gathered her cup. "That's not the job, that's just me. Good night, Arthur." She left, and I sat in the dark kitchen where staff had eaten for generations, where I'd eaten as a boy, and I thought about how the 2 people my grandfather had ruined most had somehow produced the only 2 people in that house worth trusting, and how the fortune everyone was killing each other over had, in the end, purchased nothing as valuable as a true sentence, said in a dark kitchen by someone who wanted nothing from you. And I resolved to pass my test, to hold the power and stay clean, to not become a sterling. It was the hardest thing I did in those 30 days, and I nearly failed it completely, because 2 days later the family stopped performing and started fighting, and one of them did something so cruel that for about 6 hours I wanted to burn every one of them to the ground and enjoy the heat. Act 8. When they turned on each other. Around day 18, the family made a collective, unspoken calculation and changed strategies. Flattering me had reached its ceiling. I was polite, I was unreadable, and none of them could tell which way I was leaning, which meant the safest path to winning was no longer to make themselves look good to me. It was to make each other look bad. So the campaign of love turned, almost overnight, into a campaign of exposure, and the Ashfords began, gleefully and viciously, to hand me the evidence against one another that I could never have gathered myself. Lawrence came to me first with a folder, an actual folder, documenting Spencer's spending, his gambling debts, a paternity situation he'd paid to make quiet, a pattern of failures at the company that Lawrence had apparently been collecting for years, saving for exactly such a moment. "I say this out of love for the family," Lawrence told me, sliding it across the table. "But you deserve to know what Spencer really is before you'd ever consider handing him the empire." It was all true. It was also handed to me by a man who'd suggested letting me die of pneumonia, presented as a service. I thanked him and kept the folder, not because I'd ever considered Spencer, but because a folder a man keeps for years on his own nephew tells you everything about the man keeping it. Then Spencer came to me with dirt on Lawrence, the senators, the bribes, a whole architecture of corruption in the shipping division that Spencer had witnessed and stored. Then Serafina came with worse dirt on both of them. Then Lawrence came back with dirt on Serafina. Within 4 days, I had been handed, by the family itself, a complete map of every crime, betrayal, and rot in the Sterling Empire, each member frantically knifing the others, each believing that destroying a rival brought them closer to $40 billion, none of them noticing that in exposing each other, they were exposing themselves, that a man who's been collecting his nephew's secrets for years is his own kind of guilty, that the eagerness to destroy family for money is the very thing that disqualifies you from being trusted with it. They thought they were competing. They were confessing. My grandfather had known they would. Put enough money on the table and people will hand the judge their own indictments, gift-wrapped, believing it's their rivals they're burying. I watched it with a growing coldness, and Elara watched me watch it, and it was almost bearable, almost an ugly kind of comedy, right up until day 20, when Spencer did the thing that nearly ended me. Spencer, losing, desperate, unable to out-scheme his father or his mother, decided to demonstrate his fitness to run the empire by showing me he could make hard decisions. And the hard decision he chose to showcase, the display of executive strength he thought would impress the man holding the money, was this. He moved to fire Elena. Elena, 30 years in that house. Elena, who'd brought the wrong wine. He drew up the paperwork himself, and he did it loudly, so I'd see. And he came to me and said, "I've been reviewing the household costs. The staff is bloated, sentimental hires, people your grandfather kept on out of pity long past their usefulness. Elena's the worst of it, slow, careless, we've all seen it. I've terminated her, effective tomorrow. I wanted you to see that I'm not afraid to trim the fat. That's what running this empire takes. Sentiment is a luxury. I'd make those calls every day. He was proud of it. That's the part I can barely tell you. He stood there proud, a peacock displaying his plumage, and the plumage was the firing of a 68-year-old woman who'd given the house 3 decades, thrown out with a day's notice as a performance of strength to impress the orphan who used to eat in the kitchen beside her. He'd taken the most powerless person in the house and destroyed her livelihood as a resume line. And he genuinely believed it would work, because in Spencer's world, cruelty to the powerless wasn't a flaw you'd hide from a judge. It was competence. It was strength. It was the whole point of having power. And surely the man holding $40 billion would recognize a fellow executioner. I have never in my life been closer to becoming what I hate than I was in the 6 hours after Spencer fired Elena. Because I had, in my pocket, the truth about my father. I had my grandfather's letter, the 1.5 pages of names, the whole rotten foundation. And I had $40 billion of leverage and a family of people who'd spent my childhood teaching me I was nothing. And now one of them had thrown an old woman into the street to impress me. And something in me, the 9-year-old, the boy from the garage, the son of the man Caspian ruined, stood up in the dark and said, "Burn it. Burn all of it. Expose the whole empire, the graves it's built on, the crimes they handed you in their folders. Take the father truth and detonate it. Choose no one. Leave them nothing. Watch Spencer, who just fired Elena for sport, inherit dust. You have the power. You have every right. They earned it. Enjoy the heat." I sat in the East Suite with the letter in my hand, and I wanted it so badly I could taste it, the clean, bright pleasure of righteous destruction. And I understood in that moment exactly what my grandfather's test of me was, and exactly how close I was to failing it. Because burning them down would have felt like justice, and it would have been power, and it would have made me, in the only way that actually counts, unsterling. A person who handed power over the powerless, used it to destroy. Spencer fired Elena to prove he was strong. If I burned the family to prove I'd won, I'd be doing the identical thing at a larger scale. The move that felt most like revenge was the move that would most completely turn me into them. Ilara found me at hour 6, letter in hand, and she didn't say careful this time. She looked at my face and she saw how far gone I was, and she did the only thing that could have reached me. She said, "Elena's downstairs. She's packing. She's terrified. 30 years, and she's got nowhere to go. You're up here holding a letter deciding how to hurt Spencer. That's his move, Arthur, hurting people to make a point. She's downstairs, real, scared right now. You can spend the next 6 hours planning how to burn this family down and enjoy it, or you can go downstairs and unfire a frightened old woman. One of those is what Sterling does. One of them is what your grandfather adopted you for. Pick." And that broke the fever, because she was right, and because Elena was real, and my revenge was a fantasy. And a fantasy of hurting Spencer does nothing for a woman packing a suitcase in the dark. I put the letter down. I went downstairs. I found Elena in the staff quarters, folding 30 years into 2 bags, her hands shaking. And I sat down with her the way she used to sit with me when I was a boy eating in that kitchen. And I said, "Elena, you're not fired. You will never be fired. I'm sorry it took me being handed a fortune to be able to say that to you, and I'm sorry for every year you and I both spent being treated like we were less than the people upstairs. Unpack. This is your home. It was always more your home than theirs." And she cried, and I didn't, because one of us had to be steady, and I'd learned steadiness in that exact room. And upstairs, I left the liter on the desk, unused. I did not burn the family that night, not because they didn't deserve it, but because I finally understood that deserving it was never the question. The question was who I'd be on the other side of the fire. My grandfather adopted the son of the man he ruined and spent 21 years unable to say sorry. I was not going to spend the rest of mine unable to say I stayed clean. Elena unpacked. And I passed barely at hour 6 with Ilara's voice in my ear, the hardest test in the will, the one that was never about them at all. But the family wasn't done. Because Spencer, humiliated when I reversed the firing in front of everyone, went looking for a weapon of his own. And he found the one thing that could actually threaten me. Not my past in that house, but my present outside it. He found out about my company. He found out I didn't need the money. And he decided that a man who didn't need the money was a man who could be destroyed for sport, the same way he'd tried to destroy Elena, and he came for the one thing I'd built that was truly mine. Act 9. The thing that was actually mine. Spencer found out about my company on day 22, and I have to give him credit. It was the first genuinely intelligent thing he did in the entire 30 days, because he found the one lever that could actually move me. Not my childhood, not the money. The small, boring, entirely mine software company I'd built in the 6 years I'd been gone. The one thing in my life that no Sterling had touched, funded, or ruined. Spencer found it, and Spencer understood, with the animal cunning of a cornered predator, that a man who doesn't need your fortune has exactly one vulnerability, the thing he built instead of it. Here's how he came at it. My company had a funding round closing, nothing dramatic, the ordinary machinery of a growing business, a group of investors putting in the capital that would let me hire the next 20 people. Spencer, through Lawrence's connections, which is to say through the vast web of leverage the Sterling name commanded, moved quietly to poison it. A word in the right ear, a rumor about my family troubles and questions about my judgment. The suggestion, from powerful people to my investors, that Arthur Sterling was distracted, unstable, tangled in a bitter inheritance fight, not a safe place for their money. He didn't have to lie much. He just had to apply the Sterling name against the one thing I'd built without it and watch it wobble. And it wobbled. On day 23, my lead investor called me, uneasy, asking questions that had clearly been planted. And I stood in the garden of the estate where I now held $40 billion of theoretical power, and felt genuinely, coldly afraid for the first time since I'd arrived. Because the thing that was actually at risk wasn't the Sterling Empire, which I didn't want. It was my company, which I did. The $40 billion was a fantasy I'd never asked for. The 20 jobs I was about to create were real, and Spencer was reaching out of the house that never wanted me to strangle them, purely to prove he could hurt a man who'd embarrassed him. Spencer came to me that evening, pleased with himself, and made his play, and it was, in its ugly way, a mirror of Lawrence's, which told me these two had learned cruelty from the same well. "Funny thing about your little company," he said. "Investors get skittish so easily. One conversation and a round falls apart. You know how it is." He smiled. "Or maybe you don't, but you're learning. Here's my thought, Arthur. You choose me. You name me the heir. And all these little rumors about your judgment just evaporate. Your round closes. Your 20 jobs get created. Everybody's happy. Or you don't choose me and, well, accidents happen to small companies with distracted founders. I'd hate to see everything you built out there fall apart because of everything you're dealing with in here." He spread his hands. "I'm just trying to help you protect what matters to you. Families should protect what matters to each other." It was extortion dressed as concern, and it was aimed at the one thing I loved. And for the second time in 3 days, I felt the fever rise, the pull toward destruction. Because now it was personal in a way the childhood cruelty hadn't quite been. Now he was threatening my 20 people, my real life, the thing I'd built to get away from exactly this. And I understood that this was the same test again, escalated. Spencer had found a way to hurt the powerless who depended on me, my employees, who could do nothing for the Ashfords, and was using them as hostages to move the money. He'd learned nothing from Elena. He'd just found bigger, more distant, powerless people to threaten. But here is where the 6 years I'd spent building a life away from these people paid off. Because I was no longer only the boy from the garage. I was also a man who'd built something real. And men who build real things have real friends. And the Sterling name was not the only kind of power in the world. It was just the only kind these people could imagine. I made a call that night. Not to threaten anyone. To tell my lead investor the truth, the whole truth, plainly. That I was in a family fight, yes. That a cousin was trying to poison the round to extort me. That here was my company's actual performance, its actual numbers, its actual people. And that they could invest in the real thing in front of them or fold to a rumor. But I wanted them to make the choice with their eyes open. And my investor, who was a serious person, listened and looked at the real numbers and said, "Arthur, we invest in founders who tell us the truth when it would have been easier to spin. The round's fine. Go handle your family." And it held. The 20 jobs held. Spencer's leverage evaporated, not because I'd out-schemed him, but because the thing I'd built was real. And real things survive rumors when you meet them with the truth. And Spencer had never built a real thing in his life, and so had no idea that they could. That's the difference the whole story turns on, I think. The Ashfords' power was leverage, the ability to make people afraid, to poison, to threaten, to call in webs of obligation. My power, the small amount I had, was that I'd made something true and treated people well while making it. And when the leverage came for it, the truth and the goodwill held the line. Spencer reached out of a house built on graves to strangle 20 jobs, and the jobs survived because I'd built them honestly. And he genuinely could not understand how that was possible, because in his entire life, he'd never possessed a single thing that wasn't held up by fear. I went to Spencer the next morning and I told him the round had closed, and I watched him realize his one intelligent play had failed. And I said only this: "You threatened 20 people who never heard your name, to move money you didn't earn, to hurt a man who doesn't want your fortune. You did to my employees exactly what you did to Elena, exactly what you've done your whole life. You reached for the powerless because they were the only ones you could hurt. I want you to understand that I've been watching all of it, and that my grandfather built these 30 days precisely so I could. You haven't been competing for the money, Spencer. You've been auditioning in front of the judge to prove you should never be trusted with it. And you've been very, very convincing." His face, when he understood, really understood, that everything he'd done to win had been the evidence disqualifying him, was the closest thing to justice I'd felt in the whole month. And I noted, with Elara's voice in my head, that this time I didn't enjoy it. I just felt tired, and sad, and clear. That was how I knew I was passing my own test at last. The satisfaction had drained out of the watching. What was left was only the wish that even one of them had been someone I could have chosen. And then, on day 24, the second letter arrived, and it told me who to watch, not by name, but by teaching me exactly where to look. And when I finally looked in the right place, I found, to my complete astonishment, that one person in that house had been passing the test the whole time, quietly, invisibly, with nothing to gain. And I had almost missed them entirely because they'd never once performed for me at all. Act 10. The second letter, and where to look. The second letter was shorter than the first and harder because it was about me. "Arthur," my grandfather wrote, "by now you've felt it, the pull to burn them down. Maybe you've already almost done it. I built that pull into these 30 days on purpose, because I needed to know if you could hold this much power over people who hurt you and not become them. I could not, at your age. I destroyed Frederick Vance partly because he'd bested me and I couldn't stand it, and I dressed my cruelty up as business the way Spencer dresses his up as strength and Serafina dresses hers up as regret. The sterling disease is that we all turn our worst impulses into virtues so we never have to feel them. If you felt the pull to burn them and not done it, then you're already more than I ever was. If you've done it, then I've failed you the way I failed your father. And I'm sorry, and I understand." Then he told me where to look, and he did it the way he did everything, obliquely, a teacher to the end. "Stop watching the ones who perform for you," he wrote. "You've learned all they can teach. Start watching the moments no one thinks are moments. The person who is kind when there is no judge in the room. Here is a specific instruction, and I want you to follow it exactly. Tomorrow, do not go down to breakfast. Tell them you're unwell. Stay in your room until noon. And then ask Elara, only Elara, she'll tell you the truth. What happened in the house while the man with the money wasn't watching? Because character is not what people do on the stage. It is what they do in the wings, when the lights are off and there's nothing to be won. You've spent 23 days watching the stage. Spend one day watching the wings. You'll find what you're looking for, and it will not be where you expect, and it will teach you what the money is actually for. So on day 25, I didn't go down to breakfast. I told them I was unwell, and the performances that generated were their own education. Lawrence sending up soup, Serafina a handwritten note, Spencer a stiff get well text. All of them still performing even to a closed door, and I stayed in my room until noon. And then I found Elara, and I asked her, "What happens in this house when I'm not in it?" And Elara, who had watched the wings for 25 days while the family forgot she counted, told me. She told me that Lawrence was unfailingly gracious to everyone who could see him and casually vicious to everyone who couldn't. that he'd made the young driver wait 4 hours in the cold rather than adjust his own schedule, that he tipped the staff nothing and blamed them for his own errors when no Sterling was present to perform generosity for. She told me Serafina treated her hairdresser and her maid as appliances, spoke through them, never learned their names in 25 days. She told me Spencer was Spencer in every room, on stage or off, contempt leaking constantly, the fired and unfired Elena flinching whenever he passed. And then she told me about Tobias. "Your brother," she said, "is the only one who's exactly the same whether you're in the room or not. And Arthur, you've been misreading him, because he's cold to you, and you assumed cold to you meant cold. It doesn't. He's cold to you because he can't figure out how to apologize for 20 years of standing by, and shame makes him stiff, and he'd rather say nothing than say something hollow. But watch what he does when he thinks no one who matters is watching." And she told me. Tobias, who wanted the empire less than anyone, who'd made no campaign, offered no bribe, performed no contrition. Tobias had spent the 25 days quietly doing the things no one would ever see. He'd found out Elena's granddaughter needed a surgery the family's insurance wouldn't cover and paid for it himself, and made Elena swear not to tell anyone, least of all me, because his words, which Elena repeated to Alara in tears, "If he does it for the money to look good, it doesn't count, and I don't want anyone thinking that's why." He'd been getting up before dawn to help the old gardener, whose back was failing, lift the heavy things in the dark, where no camera and no judge would ever see. He'd sat for an hour with the driver Lawrence left in the cold and brought him coffee and talked to him like a person. 25 days of invisible decency, performed for no audience, aimed entirely at the powerless, by the one member of the family who'd concluded he had no chance of winning, and therefore had nothing to gain by being good. That's the part that undid me. Tobias believed he couldn't win. He'd looked at the will, looked at me, remembered 20 years of standing silently by while I suffered, and concluded correctly, reasonably, that the orphan would never choose the bystander who'd watched him drown. So Tobias had removed himself from the competition entirely in his own mind, which meant that everything he did in those 30 days, every dawn spent helping the gardener, every secret surgery paid for, was done with genuinely nothing to gain, by a man who'd written off the prize, purely because that was who he was when no one was keeping score. The others were good on stage and cruel in the wings. Tobias was stiff and awkward on stage and quietly, secretly, pointlessly good in the wings, and the wings are where the truth lives. I sat with that for a long time, because it complicated everything. Tobias had stood by while Spencer tormented me. That was real. I wasn't going to pretend it away. A bystander to cruelty is not innocent, and I'd spent a childhood learning exactly how much a silent witness costs. But I also had to hold the other thing Alara showed me, which was that the boy who stood silently by had been, himself, a child in that house, adopted, precarious, one rung above me and terrified of falling to my level, and his silence had been the silence of a frightened kid buying his own safety by not making waves, which is a real failure and also a deeply human one, and which he had apparently spent his adult life quietly ashamed of and quietly trying to make up for in a currency that only counted if no one saw it spent. "He never told you about the surgery," Ilara said. "He never told you about the gardener. He's not going to. He's decided he doesn't deserve to be chosen, and he'd rather lose honestly than win by showing you the good he did. Do you understand how rare that is, Arthur? In this house? A man doing good and actively hiding it from the one person who could reward him for it, because being rewarded for it would make it worthless to him?" She looked at me. "Your grandfather told you to watch the wings. That's what's in the wings. That's the whole answer if you want it." But I didn't take the answer yet, because a just choice can't be made on one conversation, and because I'd learned in that house that even real virtue could be a performance if you weren't careful, that Serafina's real guilt had been a weapon, that people could feel the good thing and still aim it. So I decided to do the last honest thing my grandfather's test required. I decided to watch Tobias myself, in the wings, unseen, with my own eyes, before I'd trust even Ilara's account. And on day 26 before dawn, I got up in the dark and I followed my brother out to the gardens, and I hid, and I watched. And what I saw there, with no one performing, no money in the room, no judge that anyone knew of, was the truest thing I witnessed in all 30 days. and it made my choice for me. And it broke my heart in the specific way that only being shown real goodness by someone you'd written off can break it. Act 11. The Wings. Before Dawn. Before dawn on day 26, I hid behind the old stone wall at the edge of the gardens and watched my brother do good where he thought no one could see. The gardener was named Diego, and he was 70, and his back had gone years ago, and there was a delivery of stone planters that morning that needed moving, heavy things, the kind of work that would have put Diego in the hospital. And in the gray light before the house woke, Tobias came out in an old sweatshirt, and without a word, without being asked, he moved every one of them, while Diego protested and Tobias waved him off and said, "Just tell me where they go, Diego. You're the one with the eye." And they worked together in the cold, the old man directing and the younger man lifting, and at one point Diego said something I couldn't hear, and Tobias laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the first real laugh I'd heard from him in the whole 30 days, a laugh he'd never once produced at that dining table full of people worth impressing. And I stood behind the wall and understood that I was looking at who my brother actually was, in the one place he let himself be it, in the wings, at dawn, with a powerless old man, for nothing. And then Diego said more clearly, "You should tell him, Arthur, what you did for Elena's granddaughter, what you do out here. He should know before he chooses." And Tobias stopped working and stood up and was quiet for a moment and said the thing that made my choice for me. "No," Tobias said. "If I tell him, it's a bribe. It becomes the same thing Lawrence is doing. Spencer, all of them, being good at the orphan to win the money. I spent 20 years being nothing to that kid, Diego. Worse than nothing. I watched Spencer torture him and I told myself I was just a kid too, that it wasn't my job to save him, and every year since I've known that was a coward's math. I don't get to fix 20 years of silence by writing a check where he can see it. If I do one decent thing in this house that isn't about the money, it has to be the ones he never finds out about. That's the only kind that counts now, the kind with my name off it." He picked up the next planter. "He's going to choose Lawrence probably, or nobody, and that's fine. I don't want the empire. I just want to get to the end of these 30 days having been, for once, the brother I should have been, even if he never knows it, especially if he never knows it. Now where does this one go?" I stood behind the wall and I did not let them hear me, and I want to tell you I was stoic about it, but I wasn't. I cried behind that wall in the cold, quietly, the way I'd learned to cry as a child so no one would hear, except this time it wasn't grief, or not only grief. It was the specific devastation of discovering that the brother you'd spent your whole life resenting had spent his whole adult life resenting himself on your behalf, and trying to make it right in the only currency that couldn't be counterfeited. The good deed with the name torn off. Tobias had understood something none of the others had come within a mile of. He'd understood that in the economy of that will, the only honest coin was the kindness you actively hid from the judge. Everyone else was mining for my favor. Tobias was deliberately burying his, because a kindness you can be rewarded for isn't a kindness anymore. It's an investment. And he refused to turn his 20 years late decency into an investment even to win $40 billion. That was the moment I knew. Not that Tobias deserved the money. I still didn't fully believe anyone deserved a fortune built on graves, but that Tobias was the answer to the actual question my grandfather had asked, which was never, "Who was kindest to you?" It was, "Who is kind when there's nothing to be won, to the people who can do nothing for them, with their name off it?" And by that test, the only test that measures the truth of a person, my bystander brother, the one I'd written off on the front steps, had been quietly, invisibly, at dawn, winning the whole month without trying to. But I need to be honest, because this story is worthless if I make it simple. And the truth was not simple. Tobias had still stood by. The dawn planters didn't erase the childhood lake, and I sat with that tension for 2 days. Because a just choice has to hold the whole truth, not just the redeeming part. And I talked about it with Alara, deep in the night, and she said the wisest thing anyone said to me in that house. "You're trying to decide if he's earned forgiveness," she said. "That's the wrong question, and it's the question that'll turn you into the judge these people deserve instead of the one your grandfather hoped for. Forgiveness isn't a prize you award to the deserving, it's a thing you do because carrying the alternative is worse. Tobias was a frightened child who grew into a man ashamed of the child he'd been, and who spent his adult life making quiet amends he'll never take credit for. You don't have to decide he's earned anything. You just have to decide whether you want to spend your life as a man who saw that and honored it, or a man who saw it and still made him pay. That's not about him. It never is. It's about who you become in the deciding. She took my hand, the first time she'd done that. The same lesson as Elena, the same lesson as the letter. Every test in this house has secretly been the same test, Arthur. Not who deserves what. Who do you become when you have the power to decide? I looked at Alara in the dark, this woman whose family my family had ruined, who wanted none of the money, who had spent 26 days keeping my soul alive in a house designed to eat it. And I understood two things with total clarity. The first was what I was going to do on day 30, and the second was that whatever I did with $40 billion, the actual fortune I was walking out of that house with was sitting across from me in the dark holding my hand. And it had cost nothing, and it was worth more than the empire. And my grandfather, I was suddenly certain, had known that too, had maybe even planned it, the manipulative, brilliant old ghost, when he hired the one other person in the world whose family the Ashfords had destroyed and put her in the house to watch me. 4 days left. I knew my choice. But before I could make it, the family made their final, most desperate moves, and on day 28, Serafina discovered the truth about my father, the truth in Caspian's letters, and she came to me with it not as a confession, but as the last and ugliest weapon of all. And I had to decide, one more time, whether to meet cruelty with cruelty or with the thing my grandfather had spent 30 days and his own death trying to teach me. Act 12. The last and ugliest weapon. On day 28, Serafina found out the truth about my father, and she turned it into the cruelest thing anyone said to me in 30 days. And she did it not out of rage, but out of strategy, which is the Serafina of it. And it nearly worked, because she aimed it at the one wound the money couldn't reach. I don't know exactly how she found it. Old records, probably. Serafina had spent her life in that house and knew where the bodies were filed. However she got there, she arrived at my door on the 28th day, holding the same truth Caspian had confessed to me in the first letter, that I was the son of Frederick Vance, the man Caspian had ruined most completely, adopted out of guilt, a living receipt for the family's oldest crime. And she came to me with it, and I braced for her to use it the obvious way, to threaten exposure, to bargain. She didn't. Serafina was smarter and colder than that. She used it to try to unmake me. "I know who you really are," she said, sitting down across from me, calm, almost gentle, the surgeon selecting her scalpel. "I know about Frederick Vance. I know you're not a Sterling, not even the charity case we all thought. You're the cleanup. You're the guilt payment. My father didn't take you in because he saw something in you, Arthur. He took you in because he destroyed your father and couldn't sleep. And a man like Caspian buys his sleep. That's what you were. Not a grandson. A prescription. 21 years you spent wondering why the old man kept you when the rest of us wanted you gone. Wondering if maybe, somewhere under it all, he loved you. And here's your answer. He didn't. He owed. You weren't chosen. You were invoiced. The great love of your life, the one person in this family you thought saw you, and you were just a receipt he kept to prove to himself he'd paid for what he broke. And it landed. God, it landed. Because it went straight past the money, past the empire, past everything I'd learned to armor, and drove directly into the question I'd carried since I was 9 years old. The only question that ever actually mattered to me. Did anyone in this family ever love me? Or was I only ever tolerated, useful, endured? Serafina had found that question, the real one, the one under the fortune, and she'd answered it with the most devastating no available. He didn't love you, he owed you. You were a transaction. And for a few hours, it worked. I sat in the East Suite and I felt 21 years of longing curdle. Felt the one warm thing I'd salvaged from that childhood, my grandfather sitting by my hospital bed for 3 nights, reframed as a man managing his guilt. And it was so plausible, and it hurt so much, that I nearly let it become the truth. What saved me, again, was a letter, the third one, which the lawyer had delivered that very morning, unopened in my drawer, and which I now tore open with shaking hands because I needed my grandfather to answer the accusation his own daughter had just made in his name. And Caspian, dead, reached out of the envelope and answered her, because of course he had known. Of course the old man had known Serafina, had known exactly what she'd do if she found the truth, had timed the letter to arrive when I'd need it most. Arthur, it read. If you're reading this on schedule, it's near the end, and by now one of them has probably found out about your father and used it to tell you that I never loved you, that you were only ever my guilt, my penance, a debt I was paying. I need to answer that, because it is the most important thing I will ever tell you, and it is the one lie in this whole house I cannot let stand. It is true that I took you in out of guilt. That is where it started. I destroyed Frederick Vance, and when his boy was orphaned, I could not live with it, and I brought you home to pay a debt to a dead man. That is the ugly, true beginning, and Serafina is right about it, and I won't pretend otherwise. But here is what she does not understand, because she has never once in her life loved anyone enough to know it. Guilt is how it started, and love is what it became. I brought you home as a penance, and then you grew up in front of me, quiet, watchful, kind to the staff when no one made you, never once cruel even to the people who were cruel to you. And somewhere in those years, without my permission, the penance turned into the realest love I ever felt. I sat by your hospital bed for 3 nights because I could not bear the thought of a world without you in it. And that was not guilt, Arthur. Guilt does not keep a 70-year-old man awake for 3 nights holding a boy's hand. That was love. The fact that it began as a debt does not make it less than love. It makes it more, because it means I did not love you because you were mine by blood or obligation or expectation. I loved you because of who you turned out to be, discovered by accident, in a boy I only meant to owe. You were not the receipt for my crime. You were the one good thing that grew out of it. You are the proof that even a man who builds on graves can, if he is very lucky and does not deserve it, be redeemed by the person he was only trying to repay. Do not let my daughter tell you that you were a transaction. You were the love I did not earn and could not explain and never once regretted. That is the truth. I am staking my last words on it because they are the last words I have. I read it 4 times, and the curdled thing in me uncurdled, and I understood that Serafina had been half right in the most important way people are half right. The beginning was guilt, yes, and completely wrong about the only part that mattered, which is that beginnings don't get to define endings, that a love that starts as a debt is still love once it becomes love, that my grandfather had looked at a guilt project orphan and, against his own intentions, come to love him for real. Serafina couldn't see it because she'd never felt it. She thought motive was destiny, that because it started as penance, it could only ever be penance, because in her own heart, every warm thing really was a transaction all the way down, and she'd assumed everyone else's was too. She'd tried to unmake me with her own limitation, projected onto a dead man who'd loved better than she was capable of imagining. I went back to Serafina and I gave her the letter to read. The whole thing. My grandfather answering her from the grave, and I watched her face as she read the part about love growing from guilt. And I watched her not understand it, genuinely not understand it. The words about love that grew sliding off her like water off glass, because she had no receptor for the concept. And I said gently, because I finally could afford to be gentle, you thought you'd found the thing that would break me, and you almost did. But you made the same mistake you've made your whole life, Serafina. You assumed everyone loves the way you do, with a ledger where every gift is a payment and every kindness is owed. Some people don't. Your father learned not to at the very end, because of me. That's the thing you were really trying to destroy just now, not my inheritance. The evidence that a person can start out owing someone and end up loving them for real. You couldn't stand that it was true, so you tried to convince me it wasn't. It's the most honest thing you've done all month. You showed me exactly what you can't feel. She had no answer, and I understood, watching her, that Serafina was in some ways the most tragic of them, because Spencer, at least, didn't know what he was missing. But Serafina could see love happening all around her and had never once been able to feel the thing she was looking at, and had spent her whole life calling it a transaction because that was the only shape her heart could hold. I didn't hate her at the end. I pitied her, the way you pity a person born colorblind, describing a sunset in shades of gray and insisting that's all there is. 2 days left. And now, with the father truth in the open between us, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. Because Elara, who had watched me survive Serafina's cruelest weapon, finally told me the rest of her own secret, the piece she'd been holding since the dark kitchen. And it turned out my grandfather's design was even deeper and even kinder than I had understood. Act 13. Cora's Secret. On the night of day 28, Elara told me the rest of it, and it rearranged the whole shape of my grandfather's plan one final time. We were in the kitchen again. It had become our place, the room where staff and strays ate, the only room in that house that had never made either of us small. And I told her about Serafina, about the father truth, about Caspian's letter answering it. And Elara listened, and then she said quietly, "I need to tell you the part I kept back, because you just trusted me with your whole history, and it isn't fair for me to keep holding mine. And because after day 30 it might matter, and I don't want it to be a surprise." And she told me who she really was. Her grandmother had worked in that house 40 years ago, that part was true. But her grandmother hadn't just been staff. Her grandmother had been the woman Caspian Sterling loved, before the empire, before the marriage the family arranged for him, before the fortune. A staff woman, beneath the Ashfords, unsuitable, and Caspian, young, ambitious, cowardly in the specific way I now knew ran in the family, had chosen the empire over her, married the woman who'd bring the shipping contracts, and left the woman he loved with nothing but a child he never publicly claimed. Elara's grandmother had raised that child, Elara's mother, alone and disowned, in the shadow of a family that pretended they didn't exist. Which meant that Elara, sitting across from me in the dark kitchen, hired as an impartial clipboard, was Caspian Sterling's biological granddaughter. Real blood. The only true-blood grandchild of the old man's actual heart, hidden for 2 generations behind the family's shame, with more genuine claim to the Sterling name than Spencer, than any of them. "He found me a year before he died," Elara said. "Tracked down his own hidden line, the way he tracked down your father's son. Same guilt, same too-late atonement. It's the one consistent thing about him, that he spent his old age hunting down everyone he'd wronged and trying to make it right in ways that mostly couldn't. He offered me money, a lot. I told him to keep it. I didn't want anything built on how he'd treated my grandmother. And instead of arguing, he asked me for something. He asked me to be the witness. He said, 'There's a boy, Arthur, the son of another man I ruined, and I'm going to leave him an impossible choice. And he's going to need one honest person in that house who wants nothing from the outcome. You're the only person alive who qualifies, because you're the only other one I wronged badly enough to be incorruptible. Watch over him. Not the money, him.'" She looked at me. "So that's what I've been doing. He didn't hire a clipboard, Arthur. He sent his real granddaughter to guard the soul of the boy he loved like a grandson, because the 2 people he'd hurt worst were the only 2 he trusted to keep each other human. That was the actual will. The 40 billion was just the machine. We were the point." I sat in that kitchen and I understood at last the full architecture of what my grandfather had built. And it was so much kinder and stranger than a game about money. Caspian Sterling, at the end of his life, drowning in the graves he'd built his fortune on, had reached out and gathered the 2 people he'd wronged most, the son of the man he ruined and the granddaughter of the woman he abandoned, and he had woven them together in a house full of the family who'd inherited his cruelty without his eventual remorse, and he had given one of them the power and the other the wisdom to guard it, betting that the 2 victims of the Sterling disease would, together, become the only 2 people capable of deciding what the poison fortune should become. He hadn't left the money to the worthy. He'd left the choice to the wronged, and he'd made sure the wronged had each other, because he knew, the old man knew, that neither of us could survive that house alone without becoming it. He was trying to build something good out of the 2 worst things he ever did, I said. Us. He was trying to make us the redemption. "Yeah," Elara said softly. "I think that's exactly what he was trying to do. The manipulative old bastard. Using his own death to force a happy ending he didn't deserve to see." She almost smiled. "It's working, a little. That's the infuriating part. It's actually working." And it was, because sitting in that dark kitchen, I was no longer the frightened boy from the garage, and she was no longer the bitter granddaughter of an abandoned woman, and the fortune neither of us wanted was going to be decided, in 2 days, by the one person Caspian trusted, with the counsel of the other person Caspian trusted, and whatever we did with it, we would do it together, cleanly, wanting nothing for ourselves, which is the only condition under which anyone should ever be allowed to decide the fate of $40 billion. When this is over, I said, the two of us are the only Ashfords who never wanted the money. That's a strange thing to have in common. It's not the only thing we have in common, Ilara said, and she looked at me across the table for a long moment, and this time she didn't carefully avoid the thing between us. This time, she let it be exactly what it was. Two people who'd survived the same house and guarded each other through it. And she reached across and took my hand, and neither of us said anything else, because nothing else needed saying. There would be time after day 30 for the breakfast that wasn't a negotiation, for Saturn, for whatever people build when they've each walked out of the same fire holding the other one up. There would be time. For now there was just a dark kitchen, and two wronged people, and a dead man's strange, kind plan quietly succeeding around us. 2 days left. I knew who I would choose. I knew what I would say. And I knew finally what the money was for. Not a prize to be won, not a curse to be handed to an enemy, but a debt to be repaid to all the graves it was built on, starting with a page and a half of names in a dead man's hand. On day 30, I would gather the family who'd performed love at me for a month, and I would give them, at last, the one thing none of them had given me in 21 years. The truth, all of it, out loud, in the dining room I was never allowed to eat in. But first there was the night before, day 29, the last night of the performances, and it was the strangest and most naked of all of them, because a deadline does to people what nothing else can. It strips them. Act 13B, the night before. On the 29th night, with 1 day left on the clock, the performances finally broke down, because you cannot sustain a lie through the last hour of a deadline. Fatigue does what suspicion can't. 30 days is a long time to wear a mask, and on the final night the masks slipped all at once, and I got to see in a single evening what each of them looked like when the performance ran out of road. Spencer came to me first, and the mask didn't slip so much as shatter. He'd been drinking. He found me in the library, and the contrition was gone, and what was underneath came out in a flood. You're going to choose Tobias, aren't you? Or Lawrence? Anyone but me. Because of some grudge, something you've decided I did to you when we were kids. Kids, Arthur. We were kids. And you're going to take $40 billion from me, from my family. Over what? A joke? A lake? Things I don't even remember, because you've spent your whole life keeping score like the... And he stopped just short of the word, the old word, the nickname. I watched it arrive in his mouth, and I watched him barely swallow it on the last night, with everything on the line, the contempt so deep in him that it surfaced even when it would cost him a fortune to let it show. That was Spencer, fully revealed. A man who would rather lose $40 billion than genuinely stop looking down on me, because the looking down was load-bearing. It was the floor he stood on, and he could not give it up even to save himself. I said nothing. I didn't have to. He'd said it all. Lawrence came second, and Lawrence did the opposite, because Lawrence was a professional to the end. No drinking, no cracking. He simply sat down across from me and dropped the act entirely, which was itself the final, most sophisticated act. We both know I'm the only rational choice, he said, calm, warm, reasonable. So let me stop performing, because you've never bought it anyway, and I respect you too much to keep trying. Here's the truth. I don't love you. I never did. I don't think any of us are capable of it, honestly. This family raises people who can't. But I can run this empire, and I'll double it, and I'll give you a quarter of everything to walk away. And that's not affection, it's arithmetic. And arithmetic is the only honest language I speak. You want honesty? That's my honesty. I'm the competent monster. Pick the competent monster, Arthur. The others are just monsters. And the terrible thing was that it was, in its way, the most honest anyone had been with me all month. And I almost admired it. And it still disqualified him completely. Because a man who tells you he's incapable of love as a closing argument for why he should inherit a fortune built on graves has told you precisely why he can't be trusted with the graves. Serafina came last, and she didn't pitch at all. She just sat with me for a while in the dark, and finally she said, quietly, "You're going to choose someone tomorrow, and it won't be me. And I find I mostly don't care about the money anymore." Isn't that strange? 30 days ago it was everything. Now I keep thinking about what you said, that I feel love happening and use it as a tool. I've been trying, since you said it, to feel something without calculating what it's worth. I can't. I sit with my own son and I catch myself pricing the affection. I think I've always been like this. I think I was made like this, in this house, by my father, the same way you were made careful and Spencer was made cruel. She looked at me. I'm not asking for the money. I'm asking, do you think a person can learn it? Late? The feeling without pricing? Or is it like a language you had to learn as a child or never? And it was the realest question anyone asked me in 30 days, and I didn't have an answer, and I told her the truth. I don't know. My grandfather learned a piece of it at the very end, from me, by accident. So maybe. But you have to want it more than you want to be right about it being impossible. And I don't know if you do. She nodded and left, and I never found out if she tried. Some questions the deadline asks don't get answered by day 30. Some take the rest of a life. And then there was Tobias, who did not come to pitch because Tobias had written himself out of it, and who I found instead out on the dark lawn near the lake. The lake, just standing there, looking at the water. I went out to him. We stood in silence for a while, the two adopted strays, at the edge of the water where the worst thing that happened to me as a child happened. And Tobias said, not looking at me, I used to stand at the window and watch him do it to you. Right here. I want you to know I remember it, even if he doesn't. I remember all of it. I was 12, and I was scared that if I helped you, I'd become you, the one they were allowed to hurt. And I chose my own safety over a 9-year-old drowning, and I've stood at a lot of windows since then, in a lot of ways my whole life, and I'm done standing at windows. He finally looked at me. Whatever you decide tomorrow, I needed to say that to your face, once, before it. Not to change your choice, just because it's true, and you deserve to hear one true thing from someone in this family before the clock runs out. And he went inside. And I stood at the lake alone. And I understood that he'd just done the one thing none of the others could. Apologized without asking for anything, on the last night, when it could only cost him and could not possibly gain him. The night before the choice, my brother had at last walked away from the window. I didn't sleep. I sat up with Alara in the kitchen, our kitchen, and we didn't talk much. And near dawn, she said, "You ready?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Good. The day you're ready to hold that much power over people is the day you shouldn't. Not ready is the only safe way to do it." And the sun came up on day 30, and the lawyer's car came up the drive, and 30 days came down to one room and one name. Let me tell you about day 30. Act 14, day 30. On the morning of the 30th day, the lawyer returned, and the family gathered in the dining room, and it rhymed with the front steps a month before, all of them arranged and waiting, performing one last time, except now the performance had 30 days of exhaustion behind it, and the smell of fear underneath the cologne. They took their seats. They left the head of the table for me. And I walked in, the son of Frederick Vance, the boy from the garage, and I sat down in my grandfather's chair to give an answer, and the room held its breath. I could have just said a name. The will only required a name. But my grandfather hadn't spent 30 days and his own death teaching me the difference between the stage and the wings so that I could waste the last act mumbling a name. So before I chose, I did the thing none of them had ever done for me. I told the truth, out loud. In the dining room I was never allowed to eat in. 30 days ago, I said, you stood on the front steps and performed a family that never existed. And for 30 days you've performed love at me, and I want to thank you, genuinely, because watching people fake something teaches you more about them than watching them fake nothing. So let me tell you what I learned. Not about who was kindest to me. You were all very kind to me. A chimpanzee is kind to the man with $40 billion. That's not information. Let me tell you what I learned about how you treated the people who couldn't do anything for you. Because that's the only thing that was ever being tested, and my grandfather knew it. And he put me at the head of this table so I could watch the parts of you that you only show when you think the judge has left the room. And then I went around the table, and I laid it out. And I will not pretend I didn't feel the weight of every eye and the pleasure of every truth, because the pleasure was real, and I'd made my peace with it. As long as I was telling truth and not dealing pain, the difference Alara had taught me, the line I'd nearly crossed with Elena and hadn't. Lawrence, I said, you offered me flattery and 15%, and you were the best of the actors, truly, a master. But you left the driver in the cold for 4 hours because your comfort mattered more than his afternoon. You tipped the staff nothing and blamed them for your own mistakes when no one who counted was watching. 28 years ago, you stood in a hospital hallway and suggested my grandfather let a 12-year-old boy die because he was a liability, not knowing the boy could hear you. I've known what you are since I was 12, Uncle. Every day since, you've only confirmed it. You were never competing for this fortune. You were confessing you should never have it, one act of hidden cruelty at a time. Lawrence's mask didn't crack, he was too good for that. But his eyes went flat and old, and he understood, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say to a truth that specific. Spencer, I turned to my cousin. You couldn't fake it for 30 days because you've never once in your life imagined that a person beneath you was as real as you are. You fired Elena, 30 years in this house, as a performance of strength to impress me, and were proud of it. You threatened 20 of my employees, people who never heard your name, to extort a choice out of me. Every single thing you did to win was a fresh reason you can never be trusted with the power to hurt people at scale. You didn't audition for the Empire, Spencer. You auditioned for a restraining order, and you were flawless. Spencer went white, then red, and started to rise, and I said, "Sit down," and something in my voice, the head of the table in it, the 30 days in it, put him back in his chair. Serafina, I looked at my aunt, and here I was gentlest because she was the saddest. You gave me the only real apology in this house, and then I watched you leave your son's name out of it because even your real guilt was a lever. 2 days ago, you found the truth about my father, and you used it to try to convince me my grandfather never loved me, the cruelest thing anyone said to me in 30 days, and you said it calmly, as strategy. You can feel things, Serafina. That's what makes you different from Spencer and worse than Lawrence. You feel love happening and you use it as a tool anyway, because a ledger is the only shape your heart can hold. I don't hate you. I've never met anyone I pitied more. The room was silent now, completely. The performances all stripped away, 30 days of masks lying on the table between us. And then I said the thing that turned the whole month, the truth my grandfather had buried in the first letter, the one that reframed the fortune they'd been clawing at. And now I'm going to tell you what none of you know, I said. What my grandfather spent 21 years unable to say. This fortune, the towers, the ships, the name, was built on graves. He wrote them down for me, a page and a half of the people he ruined to build it. And the man he ruined most completely, the one whose destruction he could never forgive himself for, was named Frederick Vance. I let it land. Frederick Vance was my father. I am not the stray this family took in out of charity. I am the son of the man Caspian Sterling destroyed to build the very house you've spent your whole lives being superior to me inside of. For 21 years, you looked down on me from a fortune made out of my father's ruin, and none of you knew, and that is the truest picture of this family that exists. You built your contempt for me on the grave of my own father, and you were so certain of your superiority that you never once wondered what it stood on. The color drained out of the whole table at once, because they understood, finally, what they'd been fighting over, and who they'd been fighting to demean, and the ground they'd stood on their entire lives shifted under them all at the same moment. So here is my decision, I said, and the lawyer lifted his pen, and 30 days came down to one sentence, and I looked around the table one last time, at Lawrence the master, at Spencer the son, at Serafina the surgeon, at Ilara in the corner who had guarded my soul, at the empty chair where my grandfather used to sit, and I named the heir to the House of Sterling, and it was not who any of them expected, and it was not myself, and the name I said broke the room open. Act 15. The name. Tobias, I said. I named Tobias. The room broke open. Spencer shot to his feet. Lawrence's composure finally cracked. Serafina made a sound I'd never heard from her. And Tobias, my bystander brother, who had written himself out of the competition a month ago, who had spent 30 days doing good with his name torn off precisely because he believed he could never be chosen, Tobias went completely still, and then he said the thing that proved I'd chosen right. "No," he said. "Arthur, no. You can't. I stood by. For 20 years I watched what they did to you and I said nothing. I don't deserve—" "Stop," I said. "I'm not choosing you because you deserve it. Nobody deserves a fortune built on graves. That's not what this is. Sit down and let me tell you what you're actually inheriting, because it's not what any of them think. And I told the whole room the truth about the money, the part even Tobias didn't know. This was never a prize, I said. My grandfather didn't leave $40 billion to be won. He left a debt to be paid. There is a list, a page and a half of families this fortune ruined to exist, including my father's, including, I glanced at Alara, who nodded, others in this room's blood that you don't even know about. And the real instruction in my grandfather's will, the one under the game, is that whoever inherits does not get to enjoy this money. They get to spend the rest of their life giving it back, finding every family on that list, every grave this empire was built on, and repaying what can be repaid, and carrying what can't. Whoever I named wasn't going to inherit a throne. They were going to inherit a reckoning. A 30-year job of turning a monument on graves back into something that honors them instead of standing on them. I watched the room understand it, and I watched the exact moment the fortune curdled in the mouths of the three who'd fought for it. Because Lawrence, Spencer, and Serafina had spent 30 days clawing at what they thought was a prize. Power, yachts, the throne of the house. And I had just told them it was a burden, a debt, a lifetime of restitution, the opposite of everything they wanted. And I watched their hunger die in real time. Watched the horror dawn that they'd been competing, tooth and claw, humiliating themselves, exposing their worst selves, to win the right to spend their lives giving away the money they'd been salivating over. If I'd named any of them, they'd have fought the will, gutted the trust, kept the money, honored no graves. That's precisely why I couldn't name them. The fortune wasn't a gift for the greedy, it was a duty for the decent, and there was exactly one decent person at that table. I'm choosing you, Tobias, I said, not because you were kind to me, you weren't. You were stiff and ashamed and honest, and honestly that was more bearable than the others' warmth. I'm choosing you because for 30 days you did good with your name torn off it. You paid for Elena's granddaughter's surgery and swore her to secrecy so it wouldn't look like a bribe. You got up before dawn to help Diego lift stone where no one could see. You wrote yourself out of this competition because you thought you didn't deserve to win, and then you spent the whole month being the only good person in this house anyway, for nothing. In the dark. That's the only qualification that matters for the job my grandfather actually left. This fortune needs someone who is decent to the powerless when there's nothing to gain, because it's going to be spent for 30 years on the powerless, by someone no one will thank. That's you. It was only ever you. Tobias was crying now, openly, the stiff bystander finally undone. I don't know how to forgive myself for the lake, he said, for all of it. For standing there. And I gave him the thing Alara had given me. Forgiveness isn't a prize I'm awarding you for good behavior, I said. It's a thing I'm doing because carrying the alternative would make me into them. You were a frightened kid who grew into a man ashamed of the kid he'd been, and who spent his adult life quietly making amends he'd never take credit for. I'm not deciding you've earned anything, Tobias. I'm deciding who I want to be. A man who saw real goodness done in the dark and honored it. Or a man who saw it and still made you pay for being 12 and scared. I choose the first one, not for you, for me. Now take the job, and let's go pay back some graves. Tobias stood, and he came around the table, and he embraced me. A real embrace this time, the first real one in 21 years. Two adopted brothers who'd both been strays in a house that never wanted either of them, finally, 3 decades late, being brothers. And over his shoulder I saw Alara, and she was, for the first time in 30 days, smiling all the way. And I understood that my grandfather's terrible kind plan had done the thing he built it to do. It had taken the 2 people he wronged most and made them the redemption. And it had taken the one member of the family capable of decency and handed him the chance to spend the poison on healing. And it had left the 3 who couldn't love with nothing but the truth about themselves, which is the only inheritance they'd ever actually earned. The lawyer wrote Tobias's name, and it was done, and it could not be appealed, and the House of Sterling passed to the one Sterling who never wanted it and would spend the rest of his life giving it away. But the 3 who lost were not finished. Because losing a fortune you thought was yours does terrible things to people who've built their whole identity on deserving it. And over the weeks that followed, Lawrence and Spencer and Serafina came apart, not by my hand, I never lifted a finger, but by the plain gravity of who they'd always been, finally unsupported by the fortune that had propped them up. Let me tell you how they fell. And then let me tell you what Tobias and I did with a page and a half of graves, and what my grandfather's last letter said, and how a story that started on the front steps of a house that never wanted me ended in the one place I never thought Anne Sterling could take me. Home. Act 16. Gravity again. I never took revenge on the three who lost. I want that on the record, the same way I've wanted everything on the record, because the whole point of 30 days was that I refused to become the thing that beat me. Everything that happened to Lawrence and Spencer and Serafina after day 30 happened by gravity. The plain physics of what occurs when people who've been propped up their whole lives by a fortune lose the fortune and have to stand on who they actually are. It turned out none of them could. Lawrence went first, and it was almost quiet. Tobias, now the steward of the empire, did the thing a decent person does when they inherit a company riddled with a master manipulator's corruption. He opened the books. Not to destroy Lawrence, Tobias had no appetite for destruction, but because you cannot repay graves with a fortune that's still generating new ones. And Lawrence's shipping division was a 40-year architecture of bribes and buried crimes, the same corruption Lawrence himself had gleefully documented and handed me as ammunition against his rivals. Tobias brought it into the light, cleaned it out, and Lawrence, exposed by the very rot he'd navigated so smoothly for decades, found that a master manipulator with no fortune behind him and no secrets left to trade is just an old man who lied for a living, suddenly with nothing to sell. He wasn't arrested, the crimes were old, the evidence tangled, but he was finished, stripped of the division, his web of leverage dissolved. Because leverage only works when people believe you can hurt them, and no one was afraid of Lawrence anymore. The man who'd found the price of everyone died broke of the one currency he'd never bothered to earn. A single person who'd stand by him for free. No one did. He'd never invested in that account. Spencer fell hardest, because Spencer had the furthest to fall and the least underneath him. He fought the will, of course he did. Hired lawyers, alleged manipulation, undue influence, a stray poisoning a dying man against his blood. It went nowhere, because Caspian had built the will like a fortress, and because the one witness to the whole 30 days, the impartial documenter the court trusted completely, was Ilara, whose records were meticulous, and whose account was devastating, and who the family had spent a month treating like furniture, never imagining the furniture was keeping the ledger that would bury them. Spencer lost the suit, lost most of what he'd had, and, this is the part that was pure gravity, lost it in a way that made him radioactive, the man who'd sued his own family over a dead grandfather's wishes and lost publicly. The name that had opened every door for him closed them one by one. And Spencer, who had never once in his life imagined the inner world of another person, discovered that a man who's only ever known how to look down needs there to be someone below him to survive, and found, for the first time, that he was at the bottom, with no one beneath him to feel superior to, and nothing inside himself to stand on. Last I heard, he was still telling the story as one where he was the victim. He'll tell it that way forever. It's the only version that lets him stay warm. Serafina simply receded. She didn't rage like Spencer or scheme like Lawrence. She was too intelligent for either. She understood exactly what had happened and exactly why she'd lost. And understanding it changed nothing. Because her limitation was never a lack of understanding, she understood love perfectly, from the outside, the way a scholar understands a country they can never emigrate to. She retreated into the smaller life the loss left her, and she carried, I think, the specific bitterness of a person who saw the good thing happening, could name it, could even feel its edges, and was never once able to hold it, who watched two wronged strays and a bystander brother build something real and warm out of her father's crimes, and could only stand outside the window and call it a transaction, because a transaction was the only shape her heart could make. I didn't hate her at the end. I sent her once a copy of Caspian's letter, the one about love growing out of guilt, with a note that said only, "He learned it late. It's not too late for you." I don't know if she read it. I don't know if she could. Some people are colorblind to the one color that matters, and you can describe the sunset to them all you want, and they'll nod, and they'll never see it. That's not a punishment. It's just the saddest way there is to be alive. None of it was my hand. I want to say it one final time because it's the spine of everything. I named a decent man to pay back graves, and I told the truth in a dining room, and then I left, and gravity did the rest. The three who fell because a fortune had been holding them up their whole lives, and now it wasn't. And underneath it there was nothing. No decency to the powerless. No love that wasn't a ledger. No self that could stand without someone to look down on. They didn't lose to me. They lost to the plain weight of who they'd chosen to be, in 30 days of choosing it in front of the one-person position to see. My grandfather knew they would. That was the whole design. He didn't build a machine to punish them. He built a mirror and made them look, and the looking did the rest. Because there is no crueler fate for a person who's built their life on being superior than to finally, clearly, see what they actually are. I felt no triumph watching them fall. I'd expected to. The boy from the garage had dreamed of it, some nights, over 21 years. But the man who walked out of that house felt only a tired, clean sadness. And the sadness was how I knew I'd passed my grandfather's test of me. The pleasure had drained out. What was left was just the wish that even one of them had been someone I could have chosen, and the quiet knowledge that the person I'd become in refusing to enjoy their ruin was the only inheritance from that house I actually wanted to keep. Because the real story, the one that mattered, was never about them falling. It was about what Tobias and I did next, with a page and a half of graves, and a dead man's last letter, and a fortune that was finally, for the first time in its blood-soaked existence, going to be spent on something other than the people who least deserved it. Act 17. A page and a half of graves. The last letter, the fourth one, came the week after day 30, and it was the shortest of all. And it was the one I keep framed now, the way another man in another story keeps a report that ruined his enemies. Mine just says, "Goodbye." Arthur, my grandfather wrote. If you're reading this, the 30 days are over, and you've made your choice. And I'm going to trust that it was a good one, because trusting you is the last thing I get to do. I have no more instructions, only a request, and a thank you, and a goodbye. The request? Spend it well. The list of names is real, and every one of them is a family I broke to build what you now get to unbuild. Find them. Find their children and their grandchildren. Pay back what money can pay back, and for what it can't, the years, the dignity, the lives, sit with them, and let them tell you what I did, and carry it, because someone in this family finally should. I could never face them. I was a coward to the end about that. I could ruin a man in an afternoon, and I could not knock on his widow's door in 40 years. Be braver than me. It's a low bar. I know you'll clear it. The thank you, for being, without ever meaning to be, the reason I became something better than I was. I built an empire, and it made me smaller every year. Then I raised a quiet boy I only meant to owe, and watching you be kind in a house that gave you every reason to be cruel taught me, too late for me to be much good at it, what a life is actually for. You did not owe me a redemption. You gave me one anyway, just by being who you are in front of me. That is the only thing I ever built that I'm proud of, and I didn't build it. I just got to watch it happen and take a little credit at the end, like the fraud I've always been. The goodbye. I'm sorry. For your father. For the years you ate in the kitchen while I told myself a hard childhood makes a strong man. For every night I should have crossed the hall to your room and didn't because I was ashamed to face what I'd made you carry. I was a coward with everyone I ever loved, and I loved you most, and so I was most a coward with you. And I ran out of time to fix it the honest way, so I fixed it the only way a coward can, with a will, from a safe distance, after I was gone. It's not enough. Nothing would be. But it's what I have. Go be the Sterling I never managed to be, the one who pays instead of takes. Goodbye, my boy. You were the best thing I never earned. Caspian. I read it, and Alara read it, and Tobias read it, and the three of us, the son of a ruined man, the granddaughter of an abandoned woman, and the bystander brother who finally showed up, set out to do the thing the old coward never could. It took years. It's still taking years. It will take the rest of Tobias's life, and mine alongside his, because a page and a half of names becomes, when you actually go looking, a page and a half of families, of children who grew up poorer than they should have because Caspian Sterling needed a shipping route or a stake or a win. We found the optics man's descendants and the broken partner's grandchildren, and yes, we found the rest of my own father's story, the pieces Caspian's guilt had never let him look at. We paid what could be paid. And for what couldn't, most of it, the years and the dignity, the things money is too crude an instrument to restore, we did the harder thing. We knocked on the doors Caspian never could. We sat in living rooms and let people tell us what the Ashfords had done to them. And we didn't defend it. And we didn't soften it. And we carried it. Because my grandfather was right that someone in the family finally should. And because there is a kind of repayment that isn't money at all. It's just being willing to hear the whole truth of the harm you benefited from. And to sit in it. And to not look away. Tobias was extraordinary at it. The bystander who'd spent his life unable to face things faced every single one, as if making up for a lifetime of doorways. The stiffness fell off him. He became, over those years, the man he'd been secretly practicing to be at dawn in the gardens with Diego. Decent, present, quietly relentless about the work. The empire shrank, on purpose, as we gave it away. And Tobias didn't mourn a dollar of it, because he'd never wanted the fortune, only the chance to have finally, for once, done the right thing out loud. My grandfather chose better than he knew, or maybe exactly as well as he knew. Either way, the poison became medicine, slowly, family by family, door by door. And Elena stayed in the house until she chose to retire. Honored, with a pension Tobias tripled, and Diego's back got the surgery it needed on the estate's account, and the staff who'd been treated like furniture for generations were, for the first time, treated like the people who'd actually held that house together, because Tobias ran it like a man who'd spent his life on the wrong side of a serving tray, which he had, and which had turned out to be the only qualification that ever mattered. As for me, I did not take the empire, and I did not take a fortune, and I want to be clear that this was not nobility, it was just accuracy. I'd built my own small true life out beyond that house, and I went back to it, richer only in the ways that don't show. I kept my company. I kept my 20 jobs, which became 40, which became more. I helped Tobias with the graves, and I gave the parts of my grandfather's money that came to me, there was some, the will saw to that, whether I wanted it or not, into the same work, my father's name among the debts being paid, which is the strangest and most complete thing I can tell you, that I got to spend part of the fortune built on my father's ruin, repaying my father's ruin, closing a circle Caspian opened before I was born. And I kept Alara. Or rather, we kept each other. The two people Caspian wronged worst, who walked out of that house holding each other up, exactly as the old man had schemed from beyond the grave. We had the breakfast that wasn't a negotiation. We saw, eventually, a great many things that weren't negotiations. Two strays, two wronged bloodlines, building something warm out of a family that had never managed warmth, which was, I came to understand, my grandfather's last and best manipulation, the one he'd never lived to see work, and the only one I'll ever thank him for. That's how the story ends, mostly. A house that never wanted me, handed to a brother who never wanted it, spent on graves a coward never faced, in the company of a woman that same coward sent to save my soul. But there's one more thing, because a will like Caspian's is never quite finished, and on the last day of the first year, a final envelope arrived that even the lawyer hadn't known about, addressed in my grandfather's hand, and it wasn't a goodbye. It was a beginning. Act 18, the envelope that wasn't a goodbye. The final envelope arrived on the last day of the first year, and the lawyer swore he'd never seen it, that it had come to his office by a courier he couldn't trace, timed, the way everything my grandfather did was timed, to reach me exactly when I'd stopped expecting anything more from a dead man. It was his handwriting, and it was not a goodbye. It was a warning. Arthur, it read. There is one name on the list I did not let you find yet, because it is the most dangerous, and I wanted you to spend a year becoming strong enough to face it before you knew. Not every person I ruined wants to be repaid. Most do, most people, when you knock on the door and sit in the harm, want acknowledgement more than money, want the truth more than a check. But one of them does not want repayment. One of them wants what I would have wanted, in their place, before you taught me better. One of them has spent 30 years wanting the Ashfords erased, root and branch, and has the means to do it, and has been waiting, patiently, the way I taught the whole world to wait, for the moment the empire had something worth taking. You've just spent a year making it worth taking again. You gave it a soul. You gave it Tobias. You gave it a purpose. And in doing that, You made it, for the first time in decades, a thing someone would want to destroy for reasons that are not greed, but justice. The same justice you'd have felt if you'd chosen the fire instead of the graves. His name is at the bottom of this letter. Watch for him. And Arthur, when he comes, remember that he is not Lawrence, and he is not Spencer, and he is not Seraphina. He is you. He is the version of you that chose to burn it down, that chose the fire I built into these 30 days to tempt you with. He is what you would have become if Alara hadn't caught you in the hallway, if you hadn't gone downstairs to unfire Elena, if you'd let the wanting to hurt them back win. You beat that temptation in yourself in 30 days. Now you're going to have to face it in a man who lost the same fight 40 years ago and has been living inside the fire ever since. I'm sorry. It's the last thing I'm leaving you, and it's the hardest, and it's the only one I couldn't solve myself, because you can't out-scheme a man who wants justice. You can only show him a different way to have it, the way you found, and pray he can still see it. Good luck, my boy. This one's yours. And there was a name at the bottom, and I'm not going to tell you what it was, because that's the next story, and because the name matters less than the shape of the thing. A man with a just grievance and 40 years of patience, coming not for money, but for the erasure of a family that had finally, in the year since Caspian died, become something almost worth saving. The one enemy you cannot simply defeat, because he's right. Because his anger is the anger I felt in the East Suite with the letter in my hand, wanting to burn it all and enjoy the heat. And the only difference between us is that someone caught me in a hallway in time, and no one ever caught him. That's where my story opens into the next one. But I don't want to end on the warning, because the warning isn't the point. The point is the thing I learned in 30 days in a house that never wanted me. And I'll give it to you plainly, the way my grandfather finally learned to give me things too late, but not too late. Here it is. When someone hands you power over the people who hurt you, and life will eventually, in some form, hand you exactly that. The test is never whether they deserve to suffer. They usually do. The test is who you become while deciding. Every cruelty in that house was someone turning their worst impulse into a virtue so they'd never have to feel it. Spencer called contempt strength. Seraphina called manipulation regret. Lawrence called predation business. And Caspian, worst of all, called ruining my father building something. The Sterling disease, and it isn't just theirs, it's everywhere. It might be in you. The ability to dress up the thing you want to do as the thing you ought to do, so you can do harm and feel righteous. The whole of wisdom, the entire thing my grandfather spent his death trying to teach me, is learning to tell the difference between justice and the pleasure of revenge wearing justice's face. Because they feel identical from the inside, and only one of them leaves you someone you'd want to be. Watch how people treat the ones who can do nothing for them. That's where the truth is. Not in how they treat the powerful, that's just strategy. In how they treat the powerless, the invisible, the servant with the wrong wine, the orphan at the end of the table, the version of you that can't affect the outcome. And then watch how you treat them too, especially once you've got power and a grievance and every reason to look away. That's the only test that was ever being administrators, in that house and in every house. Not who's kindest to the king, who's kind to Elena. My name is Arthur Vance. I took my father's name back in the end. It was the one inheritance worth keeping. I was the quietest person at every table for 21 years, and then a dead man handed me $40 billion and 30 days and asked me to become someone worth the silence. I gave the money to a brother who'll spend his life repaying graves. I gave my heart to a woman my family wronged as badly as they wronged me. And I kept for myself only the one thing that house could never take and never give. The knowledge that when I was handed the power to become them, I chose, barely, with help, in a hallway, at hour 6, to be something else instead. They gave me the best room in the house the day I became worth money. But I only ever wanted the thing they'd denied me for 21 years, and it turned out it was never theirs to give or withhold. A seat at the table. I have one now. I built it myself, out beyond their gates, and everyone who sits at it, every single one, gets treated like they belong there, especially the ones who can do nothing for me, especially those. The end. Continued in episode 18, The Man Who Chose the Fire.